Good. What's up, family? Hope everyone is well in the building. I'm in the mass media group. Yeah. So wondering from all the family, see how everyone thought about the current, I guess the past, current, something past, current session. So we're gonna go in part two. That's coming up shortly. So thanks everyone for coming. Let's see who's in the building. What's up, Michael from NYC in the building? Freedom on deck. Yup. Who else is in the building? BTP Riri. What's up, fam? Thanks for coming through. We really appreciate you coming through. Make some comments. Let us know how y'all feeling in the building. Let's see here. Well, who else is saying here? People letting personal vendetta make them crash out. Interesting. Big J. What's up, bro? F1 us. I'm assuming that means freedom, freedman. Yeah. In my zone. My zone, indeed they are. Facts. Yeah, they're probably gonna start part two pretty soon.
Hello.
So we got that. Got it queued up pretty soon. I think Chair Moore is testing out the microphone. I think you guys can hear that in the.
Hello. Hello.
So yeah. So
Hello.
we just pulling
It
it
is
up right
2
now.
o'clock. We're 10 minutes over.
It is 2 o'clock. We're 10 minutes
I'll
over.
turn to
So we have
Parliamentarian
to start
Johnson.
promptly. I'll turn to Parliamentarian Johnson.
Roll call
so
vote
that
to
she can,
reestablish a quorum.
do
All
a
right,
roll
fam,
call
we're gonna
vote to
go on mute.
reestablish a
See you.
quorum.
See you. Peace.
Thank you. I will begin the roll with the chair.
Present.
Chair Moore is present. Vice Chair Brown. Present. Vice Chair Brown is present. Member Bradford. Member Bradford is present. Member Grills. Member Grills is present. Member Holder. Member Holder is present. Member Jones Sawyer. Member Jones Sawyer is absent. Member Scott Lewis. Member Scott Lewis is present. Member Montgomery Stepp. Member Montgomery Stepp is present. And Member Tamaki. Member Tamaki is present. Madam Chair, there are 9 task force members and the number needed for quorum is 5. The number present is 8. Madam Chair, a quorum has been established.
Thank you, Parliamentarian Johnson and task force members. So the next item on our agenda is agenda item number 8, tax law considerations. We will be hearing from 3 expert witnesses on this topic, 2 of which are here joining us in person. Thank you, Sarah Moore Johnson, and thank you, Raymond Odom. And then on the line, we have Georgetown Law Professor Dorothy Brown. So without further ado, I will now introduce our first 2 expert witnesses. Sarah Moore Johnson is a founding partner at Birchstone Moore LLC, a boutique estate planning law firm in Washington, D.C., where her practice focuses on transfer tax planning and family wealth stewardship for clients whose net worth is $50 million or greater, as well as the administration of estates and trusts. Sarah graduated magna cum laude from Wake Forest University with a BS in Business and the University of Georgia School of Law, where she received her Juris Doctorate. She is licensed to practice law in District of Columbia, Maryland, Virginia, and Georgia. I don't know if my mic is fully working. Okay. Sarah is a past president of the Washington, D.C. Estate Planning Council, where she started a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative, a fellow of the American College of Trust and Estate Council, and she serves on the Board of Trustees of the Greater Washington Community Foundation, which has made closing the racial wealth gap its strategic mission. Thank you for joining us, Sarah Moore Johnson, if we can clap for her. Then we will hear from Raymond Odom. Raymond C. Odom is Senior Vice President at Northern Trust in Chicago, Illinois. He serves as a Managing Wealth Partner, Director of Wealth Transfer Services, providing wealth transfer and estate tax consultation to Northern Trust partners and their clients. Ray has a Bachelor of Arts from Valparaiso University and a JD from the Ohio State Moritz College of Law. He is an attorney licensed to practice law in Illinois and before the U.S. Tax Court, and is a certified financial planner and is one of 6 Black fellows in the 2,400-member American College of Trust and Estate Council. Ray's father, Nathaniel M. Odom, founded the DuPage County, Illinois chapter of the NAACP that secured one of the first municipal open housing ordinances in the country shortly after Dr. King failed to establish such legislation in Chicago. Thank you, Raymond Odom, for coming, and we can clap for him as well. And without further ado, I'll turn to Mr. Odom and Ms. Moore Johnson. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Moore and Task Force Member Don Tamaki.
Excuse me. Assembly Member Joan Sawyer, you're recognized. Thanks for joining us. Oh, thank you. We also want to recognize Assembly Member Akila Weber, who is in the back. If she can stand up and we can clap for her. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. Excuse me.
Yes. All right. So thank you all for having us here today. It is an honor and a privilege for both Mr. Odom and me, professionally and personally. We've been following your work since its inception, and we never really dreamed that we'd be here in front of you today. So thank you. You may be wondering why you are hearing testimony from 2 estate planners. Ray Odom and I know each other through the American College of Trust and Estate Council, as you mentioned. It's an organization that prides itself on admitting only the best and brightest estate planning attorneys in the world. Yet, due to systemic racism, as you mentioned, of the 2,500 fellows of the college, only 5 were Black at the time that I met Mr. Odom. After the murder of George Floyd, we got together and posited the idea, what if we used the estate tax to pay for reparations? We thought surely someone would have thought of this before us. But our searches turned up only one hit, the exceptionally well-researched book, and if you could please advance 2 slides. The exceptionally well-researched book, Redeeming the Promise of Abolition by Catherine Franke, a professor of law at Columbia University. Like me, Catherine Franke is a white woman. For those whose my back is to, I am very white. But she understands that part of her success in life is attributable to her privilege. And in the book, it's really fascinating. She shows an openness to using white wealth for reparative justice, suggesting that her inheritance at the death of her parents should be used for reparations. One of the criticisms that you'll hear about using white wealth for reparations is the idea of unfairness. The refrain is, I didn't do it, it wasn't me, I shouldn't have to pay for it. A remarkable benefit of the estate tax is that essentially it is a tax on no one. The estate belongs not to the wealth creator who is deceased or to the wealth creator's family. It is only through the action of the law, the courts, and the government that the wealth passes to family members at death. As Professor Dorothy Brown's book, The Whiteness of Wealth, reveals, the tax code has incentivized white wealth building for years. Ray and I also intuitively understood that if we could harness those tax incentives to create a public-private partnership to help fund reparations, we could get our wealthy clients to willingly and enthusiastically embrace using their own money to pay for reparations. Once we started digging into our ideas, we found that history was on our side, starting with the ideology of our founding fathers. Ray, and if you could, next slide.
So you see here the paradox of wealth creation in America. Now, the interesting thing is that were 2 implicit imperatives of the constitutional framers. The imperative to prevent swollen concentrations of family wealth, and a second imperative to protect the stolen wealth of enslaved African wealth. So you see, there were 2 implicit imperatives, and the first was around this idea of swollen wealth or concentrated wealth. You see, Thomas Jefferson and the framers knew one thing, that they needed to reject the inherited privileges of European feudalism. Now, if you remember feudalism, that's when the property owns the people, and the property and the people are owned by an overlord. Well, they knew they didn't want that. And so what they decided to do was they would create this small farmer necessity. And so the thought was is that you'd have these small farmers, these, as America always said, small business owners running America, that would allow for this equitability. The problem is that while saying that, Thomas Jefferson himself inherited over, yes, 16,000 acres. He inherited enough to be the size of the city limits of Cleveland. And so as he was talking about in his Declaration of Independence, pictured there, of everyone started equal, he knew that he was going to be more equal than everybody else in that room. The reality is that was true of many of the original framers. And the point here is that malady, that paradox is what began to lead to concentrated wealth in America becoming a problem. You see, the other reason why it was a problem was that this equal starting line assumed that any efforts by people after that starting line would be a result of their own labor and meritocracy. Well, the problem is that, yes, on the other side of that picture, you'll see, yes, 600 enslaved people were owned by Jefferson. And the picture shows that the reality is those are the people who created his ongoing wealth from his unequal starting line. Well, with the next slide, what I wanted to show is that your question might be, well, yeah, we've got it. We understand that there was stolen wealth. And by the way, I didn't spend any time on that because this panel certainly understands the concept of stolen wealth. But the question you should have for me is, but Ray, how do you know that there's concentrated wealth? We get the Thomas Jefferson thing, but it's a little bit past that now. What's going on? Well, this is the concentrated wealth, 1/10 of 1%, not 1% here. This is 1/10 of 1%, starting in around 1913, had 25% of America's wealth. 25%. Again, 1/10 of 1%, not 1%, 1/10 of 1%. And you say, what happened? What did that lead to? I'm going to come back to that the second time I talk after Sarah, and I'll show you exactly what our country did when it got to this point. But your question is now, okay, Ray, I see this chart. It makes sense to me. 1/10 of 1%, 25%, 1928 or so. But yeah, then I remember there's some stuff happened, and but it only goes to 2012. What happened after 2012? The next slide will show that, yeah, it didn't end in 2012. The Ben Franklin part of this shows that exactly 31.2%, or ultimately what it amounts to is this, $34 trillion out of 112 trillion. $34 trillion is concentrated in 1% of America's population. 1%. Let that sink in. So then you say, all right, what's this next green shaded part? Well, that's the 1%. So you can see that between the 1%, and the other 9%, 10% are around 40 trillion. And so you're saying, but Ray, where am I? Well, I'm in that bottom, that lower mint shade there. That's the rest of it. And that represents the 50% of people at the bottom. They only own $7 trillion. Yes, you heard me right. 7 trillion of the 110 is owned by 50% of America. So the question you have for me, and the next slide keeps wanting to flip anyway. The question you have for me is, look, Ray, that's fine for America, but remember, we're here, we're in California, we're here in LA, near LA. What's going on here? And the next slide shows that. And the next slide simply is a comparison really taken from your materials, which shows that in the LA metropolitan area, where the median wealth is around 355,000, the median wealth for U.S. blacks, and by the way, I thank the committee for making that distinction between African immigrants and African Americans, their median wealth, $4,000. What's the point? Well, 1.1 to 1. I make it on the next slide. The next slide shows this. It shows the average wealth, and you all are well familiar with Professor Darity and his statement that average wealth is a better reflection of what we need to do than median. But with average wealth, it's clear that with an $812,000 median dollar difference, white wealth about $953,000 average white wealth, Average Black wealth, 141,000. What's the point, Ray? The point is that disparity of 812,000 makes the point I'm trying to make to you. Yes, America has a wealth disparity. Yes, we messed up on that first imperative. Remember, we didn't make that first imperative, they did. They made that imperative because they did not want to live in a feudal system nor have a Bolshevik revolution. But as we're going to be able to show you, they fell apart by not noticing one thing. The bottom of that wealth disparity picture is, yes, African Americans. And so our proposition, we'll repeat over and over again, is real simple. If you have a tax designed to eliminate wealth disparity, you should take the revenues from that tax and aim it at the most wealth disparate people group. Hello, that would be African Americans. Sarah?
So as we're thinking about the racial wealth gap and how to correct it, we have to understand how intrinsically, next slide, our country's wealth outcomes are tied to tax policy. I want to focus on two key eras of tax history: the era of progressive taxation, which lasted from 1916 to 1980, versus the modern era of regressive or anti-tax policy, ushered in with the election of Ronald Reagan. With progressive tax policy, those who make the most pay the most in taxes. In a regressive environment, lower earners pay a larger percentage of income in taxes than higher earners. In the 50-year period from 1932 to 1981, we had a truly progressive tax policy. Top income tax rates ranged from 63% to 94%. Can you imagine today a top tax rate of 94%? There would be incredible outcry. You might think that such exorbitant tax rates would have a chilling effect on the economy, but quite the opposite. As this task force knows from its work, in this same period of progressive taxation, home ownership grew by about 50%, and the middle class became the largest income tier in the United States at 61% of households by 1971. Yet you also know that although the taxes were paid by Americans of all races, the primary beneficiaries of the government programs funded by such revenue were white. Nevertheless, when politicians today hearken back to the glory days of America, a time when the middle class was vibrant and a person could own a car and a home and retire with a nice pension, those same politicians rarely mention that this was the era of the highest tax rates in our history. The regressive tax movement started right here in California. Political protest against high taxes led to Proposition 13, a constitutional amendment approved by California voters in 1978 that protected landowners from large increases in property taxes. And then came the election of a Californian to the Oval Office in 1980. President Reagan immediately ushered in the biggest tax cuts in American history. The precipitous drop in tax rates that you see in this chart were all during his tenure. But in the Reagan era, the promise of trickle-down economics did not come to fruition. A study in our materials reveals that worldwide, tax cuts do not affect macroeconomic measures such as gross domestic product or unemployment. The only real effect they have is that the incomes of the rich grow much faster in countries that cut taxes. Those results, next slide, definitely bore out in the United States. Actually, skip that. This chart shows, similar to the chart that Ray showed earlier, this is the average, or I'm sorry, this is median of racial wealth gap from 1963 to 2016. So I've drawn a line on this chart where Ronald Reagan was an elected president, and you can see that prior to his election, the growth of the white wealth in the blue line was steady, but it was really after his passage of tax cuts that the racial wealth gap really took off, and whites kept growing, and there was relatively no growth for Black Americans. But this is not solely due to income taxes. There is perhaps no greater promoter of the racial wealth gap than the untaxed gifts and inheritances received by white families, who are 3 times more likely to receive an inheritance than members of Black families. Until recently, most Americans were subject to both federal and state estate taxes at death. From 1941 to 1976, anyone who died with $40,000 to $60,000 into their name was subject to estate tax, and the highest marginal rate was 77%. If a person died in 1976 with $10 million of assets, their estate would pay almost $6.5 million to the US Treasury. Today, that estate would pay nothing. I want to take you back, next slide, to the chart that Ray shared earlier, showing the percentage of the country's wealth owned by the top 0.1% since the income and estate taxes were enacted in the early 20th century. And I've layered this with the chart at the bottom. This chart shows the estate tax rates and exemptions. The line along the top is the tax rates, and you can see that they jumped up in the middle there and are coming back down. The line along the bottom is the estate tax exemption, which was very low, that $40,000 to $60,000, and is now climbing up. Well, as you can see, there's a direct correlation. Immediately after estate taxes were raised to their highest rates and the exemption from the tax was lowered to its lowest amount, the concentration of wealth in our country began steadily falling from a high of 20% to a low of only 7% of wealth owned by that top echelon of Americans. But as soon as the top tax rates start to fall, the amount that can be exempt from the estate tax starts to rise, the wealth concentration begins to creep back up again. And these charts end in 2013 and 2015. They don't even get to the worst of it. Next slide. This is a list of the estate tax exemptions and the top tax rates in the modern era. When I was taking my law school class in 2000, in the estate tax class, the exemption was only $675,000 and the top tax rate was 55%. So most middle and upper middle class taxpayers in America paid an estate tax at the death of the surviving spouse. By the time I graduated from law school, the George W. Bush tax cuts had gone into effect. Between the Bush legislation and the Trump Tax Act in 2018, and with an assist from President Obama in between, the estate tax exemption systematically rose from 1 million to 3.5 million to 5 million to today, the incredibly high amount of $12.92 million. And the rate ultimately settled at 40%, where it remains today. What this means is that in 2023, a married couple can leave $25,840,000 to their heirs without paying an estate tax. And we, as estate planners, have all sorts of ways of helping these taxpayers leverage that exemption to pass even more wealth, insane amounts of wealth, to their heirs free of tax. I won't bore you today with how we do that, but I will tell you that it is all perfectly legal and within the bounds of the tax code. What should be of interest given our nation's history is the fact that a common estate planning technique is to take that $26 million exemption and put it into a trust that we call a dynasty trust that lasts for generation after generation after generation, and never an estate tax is paid. We have allowed our country to return to the very aristocracy we were trying to avoid. Next slide. From a revenue perspective, let's go one more. The estate tax is just plain sad. In 2020, only 1,900 estates were subject to the tax, generating only $16 billion of revenue. This chart shows how much of each type of tax in America contributes to the national revenue. The income tax and the payroll tax that we assess on hardworking Americans contribute the most, shown here in dark blue and gold. Or sorry, that's the lighter blue. The estate tax is part of that little gray sliver along the top. It generates less than 0.5% of the country's revenue. One commentator described it as a zombie tax. It's neither alive nor dead, it just lurks around scaring people. But it doesn't have to be that way. We are on the precipice right now of a massive wealth transfer. It is expected that as the baby boomers pass away, almost $70 trillion of assets will change hands. If we could bolster the estate tax by increasing rates and lowering exemptions, the federal government and the states could share in a significant percentage of that $70 trillion, and we could use it for reparations. One way to do this is by helping the public understand the purpose of the estate tax.
The next slide. So one of the things that you should wonder is, why would a guy that works with wealthy people come up with a word like swollen wealth? You know, that could be a career limiting term for me. But the reality is I didn't come up with that term. You see, that came from a president, President Theodore Roosevelt. Now, I'm kind of jumping ahead, but he says this when he's giving a speech on, I think it was called The New Nationalism. And notice that this speech was given at the dedication of, yeah, you got it, the John Brown Memorial Park. I just want to stop and just like applaud there. Yeah, that John Brown, the John Brown that took on the entire world. That's where he's delivering the speech. And listen to what he says, among other things. The really big fortune, the swollen fortune, by the mere fact of its size, acquires qualities which differentiate it in kind as well as degree from what is possessed by men of relatively small means. Therefore, I believe in a graduated inheritance tax on big fortunes, properly safeguarded against evasion and increasing rapidly in amount with the size of the estate. And then he talks about those who are opposed to that kind of thing. Listen to how serious he is about this. Those who oppose reform will do well to remember that ruin in its worst form is inevitable if our national life brings us nothing better than swollen fortunes for the few and the triumph in both politics and business of a sordid and selfish materialism. Yeah, that's one thing. You can say that and still stay president, but the reality is, and here's the political cartoon, which really makes the point I'm really trying to drive home today. You see that guy with the swelling? Yeah, he's all swell up. That literally, they understood this. He's saying that everyone in that era, the early 1900s, understood what the president was trying to do. He was after that swollen wealth. He wanted to take that guy into the surgical room, cut some of that wealth off, and redistribute it. That was the point. And my tagline here is an estate tax on swollen white wealth to replace theft of stolen black wealth. Next slide. So you're saying, Ray, that was nice. We appreciate you saying that. But that, he's been gone a long time. Can you bring us a little more current? Well, another wealthy and powerful white man, actually the father of an even more powerful and wealthy white man, Bill Gates Jr., his father, Bill Gates Sr., from Seattle, recently deceased, wrote a book called Wealth in Our Commonwealth. And in it, he says why America should tax accumulated fortunes. You wonder, when did he write that book? I'll tell you when he wrote it. He wrote it during the time that they were trying to repeal estate taxes. And that repeal originated from a estate planner here in California. Yes, you heard me, here in California. And I wish I had time to tell you the story. It's unbelievable. One estate planner literally put together a program that repealed. I know, stop. So anyway, let me get on. Let me get on to what Bill Gates Sr. said. What he says is this. He said this: the essence of the American experiment is our collective rejection of European hereditary aristocracy and grotesque inequalities of wealth. That's true. That's true about America. It just is. Both Hamilton and Jefferson agree with it. And he says for many Americans, the estate tax is remote, so they don't care, they don't know, they don't want to be bothered with it. It doesn't help anybody. The only people it hurts are constantly trying to figure out a way around it. But he said this, and this is the point I want to leave you with. There is something poetic, I love that word, about allocating estate tax revenues to particular initiatives that strengthen equality of opportunity in America. That strengthen equality of opportunity in America. Yeah, he didn't know about your task force. If he would have, he probably could have said that strengthened giving reparations to the group that's been most misaligned and stolen from in America. But of course, he didn't. But next slide shows the point I'd like to make in terms of the overall point of California. Because here's what you're saying to me. You're saying to me, Ray, we appreciate you coming here. Maybe we agree that, that the framers originally did not want concentrations of wealth. Maybe we can go along with it. And maybe we can go on, we definitely go along with you, that they stole wealth from enslaved Black people and continue to steal it for all the centuries after that. And maybe, Ray, we could even agree with you that the estate tax is jacked up. I mean, it's gone from 77% down to 40. It's gone. Now we can come, but Ray, we're in California. Bring it home. What does this have to do with us? I'm glad you asked. You see, long ago and far away, when they had the estate tax in place, what it did, it actually was a replacement for taxes that were being raised by the states. You see, it was the states that were principally using death taxes as a way to raise revenues. Well, when the federal government decided to start using that as something they wanted to take, states got a little tick. They said, oh, just hang in there. So in 1924 or so, they said, look, here's what we'll do. We will give a dollar for dollar credit for the tax that's paid by your state residents to you all. And so this will all be fair. We won't be taking any more than we should. And so what states did, they got smart and they said, oh, that's easy then. What we'll do is we will tax our residents' domiciles based on whatever the credit is that they get for the federal government. So the federal government gives you used to give you a 16%, up to 16% of their taxable estate credit for your state tax. So this was easy for the state. Said, look, we'll just take whatever it is that you're getting as a credit on that federal return. Yeah, give us that money. Really easy to administer, really easy to figure out. Just send us the check. But again, when that estate tax got repealed or cut back, yeah, you lost the estate pickup tax. Real money. How much money? $1.8 billion. Real California money was lost by the change in estate tax. Now, I know that $1.8 billion is probably not going to give you guys all the money you need for the reparation proposal you're doing. But the point is, it's very important to have a start and to have a way to tie a wrong to the source of the revenue. Next slide. And that's exactly what I think was ingenious about what Evanston did. I know the Black criticisms, especially Professor Darity, about Evanston. You know, it wasn't really reparations. It was really small. You know, how much can a cannabis tax raise? But what they did that framed it so that people couldn't attack them was they said, look, we're just going to go to where one of the wrongs occurred. It occurred with over-policing around cannabis. We'll now make cannabis is legal. We'll tax legal cannabis, and we'll use the tax on that to go back towards the people that we over-policed. We'll tie the wrong and some revenues from that we're getting by righting that wrong. Revenue tied to wrong. Revenue wrong. And that was something people could get their arms around. And that's what I'm saying about estate tax. Estate tax is a narrative that will allow you, this state, to be able to get people's arms around the idea there was a wrong. And now there's a way to right that.
So not only are state and local governments like California and Evanston addressing reparations, next slide, but charities have gotten into the mix as well. And I'm sure you all have heard about Georgetown University's efforts to redress the sale that its founders made back in 1838 of 272 enslaved people in order to save the school from bankruptcy. The GU 272 descendants have been genetically established, and the Jesuits and the university have pledged to raise $1 billion for a newly created Descendants Trust and Reconciliation Foundation. Some churches are also atoning for their role in the slave trade. In the Episcopal Church, the dioceses of Texas, New York, and Maryland have set aside a combined $15 million for long-term projects benefiting African Americans. So to allow the government to leverage the progress and existing infrastructure of charitable organizations, we have the idea that you could develop incentives to allow private citizens and private companies to redistribute wealth. To be clear, racial repair is a matter of justice based on broken promises and human rights violations. Therefore, reparations cannot proceed from a request for generosity. While it is incorrect to call racial repair charitable work, nevertheless, we have a tax deduction framework for charitable contributions that is useful here because it is easily understood and readily adopted by wealthy white taxpayers. We believe that tax deductions should be allowed for private contributions to racial repair because individual taxpayers would be paying a debt of the federal or state government on the government's behalf. Let's start with what California could do today and then move on to our ideas quickly at the federal level. Under existing federal tax law, California could create a state-sponsored reparations trust fund, like that Georgetown fund, to which individuals should be able to make federal and state income tax deductible charitable contributions. So how would this work? Charitable contribution tax incentives are currently permitted under Code Section 170 for contributions that an individual makes to the United States or to a state or local government, but only if that contribution is for exclusively public purposes. Traditionally, we think of this along the lines of the wealthy donor who gives money for the library or the public park. It follows that even with no changes to the current Internal Revenue Code, individuals should be able to make tax-deductible contributions to a California state-sponsored reparations trust fund, if and only if racial repair is recognized at the federal level as a public purpose. And there is precedent for this. In Bob Jones University versus the United States Supreme Court held that racial discrimination in education was contrary to a fundamental public policy when they revoked the university's tax-exempt status. If we invert that statement, then preventing or correcting racial discrimination has been held by the Supreme Court as a fundamental public policy. If the state of California or a group of California taxpayers could obtain a ruling from the IRS that confirmed that racial reparative justice is a public purpose, then contributions to a state-run trust fund that administers and distributes reparations might be tax deductible in the same manner as contributions to public charities. Even at the federal level.
Sorry, can I just
Yep.
ask,
Mhm.
just to truncate it a little bit, it's not your fault, but we
Yep.
do have another expert witness on the
Yep.
line.
I think we have 2 ideas that we want to share quickly, and then we will leave it to you all. And the first would be to create a new, next slide, 501c40 reparations organization at the federal level. C40 would commemorate the Lost 40 Acres Promise and HR 40. We suggest that reparations organizations have as their purpose carrying out the recommendations of the HR 40 Commission or this task force. The purposes should be dictated by African Americans and not the white patriarchy of the body politic. The HR 40 legislation and your own findings suggest that the purpose of these types of organizations could be economic assistance, housing benefits, educational opportunities, healthcare initiatives, or criminal justice reforms. And these charitable organizations could be permitted to make expenditures for communities at large, or they could make direct payments to individuals. Thousands of these organizations already exist as our public charities, and they would automatically qualify as 501c40s. But we imagine that new organizations would be developed as well because of the tax incentives. To maximize charitable contributions to 501c40s, we would build on the existing expenditures already used by the wealthy, but make them even more enticing so that wealthy white taxpayers would not be able to resist helping to pay for reparations. Our proposal would give 501c40 reparations organizations the most favorable tax status. And I'm going to skip through those details, but just to say that they're there in our materials. And what we would also do is, if you all decided to make direct payments to African Americans as part of the reparations process, that next slide, those could be held, actually one more, in what we would call a 501c40 account, similar to the framework that we already have for college savings plans under Section 529 of the Code. We as a government have allowed people to save for college on an income tax-free basis by putting dollars into 529 accounts. We could do the same thing with reparations payments. An eligible recipient could put them in a 501c40 account. The account could grow income tax-free, and if distributions were made for eligible purposes, then those distributions would be free of any income tax. We would also suggest that those accounts be able to be passed to the recipient's family members who are also eligible recipients at their death, thus allowing Black Americans to finally have an inheritance that can be passed on to other generations. Thank you.
Comments, but I do just want to respect the time of law professor Dorothy Brown. And again, thank you so much. Is Dorothy Brown still on the line?
Yes, she is.
Oh, okay. Thanks so much, Professor Brown. I will now introduce you, and then after that, we'll take comments and questions from all three of you. Okay. So, Professor Brown is a professor at Georgetown Law. She holds the Martin D. Ginsburg Chair in Taxation at Georgetown University Law Center and is an advocate for economic and social justice. She is the author of The Whiteness of Wealth: How the Tax System Impoverishes Black Americans and How We Can Fix It. She is well known for her work in a variety of areas: the effects of tax policy by race, class, and/or gender, workplace equity and inclusion, and law school reform. She is also the author of the path-breaking critical race theory, Cases, Materials, and Problems, which applies a racial lens to foundational law courses such as contracts, property, civil, and criminal law and procedure. She is a co-author of Federal Income Taxation, Cases, Problems, and Materials. Thank you so much, Professor Brown, and you may begin your expert testimony.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank Chair Moore, Vice Chair Brown, and each member of the task force for inviting me to share my views with you today. I want to begin by thanking you for including a discussion of tax policy consideration into your deliberations, because they are certainly relevant to any discussion about reparations. My book, The Whiteness of Wealth, showed the various ways that our federal income tax system disadvantages Black Americans, while at the same time advantaging white Americans. Whether Black Americans are getting married, owning a home, paying for college, working, or simply trying to build intergenerational wealth, our tax laws as written have a racially disparate impact. Black Americans are less likely to gain access to their tax breaks that their white peers receive, and therefore are more likely to pay higher taxes than their white peers. My ideal solution was to argue for a reparations tax credit designed to compensate Black taxpayers for their decades of paying higher taxes. As I describe in the book, however, such a tax credit would be unlikely to prevail against a federal constitutional challenge, given the lack of proof that Congress enacted tax provisions with the specific intent to discriminate against Black Americans. I argue as a second best alternative, a wealth tax credit applicable to all taxpayers in households with below median wealth. Given the racial wealth gap, this will result in a disproportionate percentage of Black households receiving the credit, but will be available to taxpayers regardless of race or ethnicity, thereby passing the test for constitutionality. Lack of intent, however, is no bar when it comes to a discussion of reparations. Slavery was an intentional system designed to exploit, subjugate, and dehumanize African Americans. As described in the task force's interim report, quote, although the US Constitution recognized African Americans as citizens on paper, the government failed to give them the full rights of citizenship and failed to protect African Americans from widespread terror and violence, close quote. So when discussing reparations and considering monetary and/or non-monetary options, there are two key goals as I see it from a tax perspective. First, you need to ensure the reparations paid are not treated as taxable income to the recipients. Second, it is important that African Americans are not paying for their own reparations, which means the source of funding needs to be carefully considered. From a non-tax perspective, one issue that you may also want to consider is whether you should prevent any pre-existing state obligations like child support or back taxes owed by reparations recipients to be used to offset any reparations payments. For example, the recent COVID economic impact payments were protected from all offsets other than state child support offsets. And there is a strong argument to be made that reparations should be protected from all offsets. Reparations are by design an attempt to make whole that which a racist system broke. To allow offsets means that money will not only not reach those it was intended to benefit, but could reach those who are complicit in the systemic racism which gave rise to the need for reparations. I want to be clear that I'm not providing tax advice or guidance, but providing a possible analysis of any reparations payments. I leave it to your tax counsel to make a final determination that you would rely upon moving forward. The first goal is to make sure that any payments would be excluded from the recipient's gross income and would therefore not be taxable. There is precedent for reparations payments being excluded from federal taxable income. In 1956, the Internal Revenue Service issued Revenue Ruling 56-518, which determined the tax treatment of payments received by US citizens who were formerly German citizens and, quote, were persecuted and thereby suffered damage to life, body, health, liberty, rights of property ownership, or to professional or economic advancement, close quote. The IRS found that the compensation paid are in the nature of reimbursement for the deprivation of civil or personal rights and do not constitute taxable income to the recipients for federal income tax purposes. The IRS also found that where the right of property ownership is involved, payments which are measured by the value of property taken from persecuted taxpayers do not in any event constitute taxable income where the taxpayer has not recovered his basis. In English, Cash received will be received tax-free, and if a payment is received regarding property, the payment will be received tax-free, at least to the extent the recipient paid to purchase the property. So if a taxpayer paid $10,000 for a piece of property that was stolen or confiscated by Germany, and that taxpayer received $8,000 in connection with that property as reparations, the $8,000 would be received tax-free because the taxpayer spent $10,000 to purchase the property. Only if the taxpayer received more than $10,000 in reparations regarding the property would an issue be raised as to whether any amount received would be taxable. And the IRS said in that case, quote, "The question whether the excess represents taxable income will be determined on the basis of the facts and circumstances of each case," close quote. This tax-free treatment of Holocaust payments was made permanent in the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2001. Both the amount of the Holocaust restitution payments and the documentation required to prove eligibility for such exclusion are omitted from tax forms altogether. So there is no additional paperwork required to show proof of eligibility. This approach seems consistent with the underlying goal of the payments. That is, the payment should be excluded from the recipient's income because the payments are designed to make them whole rather than viewed as an accrual of new wealth. Finally, there would ideally be no third-party reporting like 1099 information returns, so taxpayers will not be flagged by the IRS as having income. The tax-free treatment of reparations paid to Holocaust survivors were extended to Japanese Americans in the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. Surviving Japanese Americans received $20,000 of reparations as a result of their mass incarceration during World War II. In the legislation that authorized the reparations payments, a provision was included that provided the following, quote, "Amounts paid to an eligible individual under this section shall be treated for purposes of the Internal Revenue laws of the United States as damages for human suffering," close quote. That meant the payments would be treated the way Revenue Ruling 56-518 provided and would be received tax-free. Assuming reparations payments were tax-free at the federal level, for states with income tax systems that follow the federal tax treatment, that would mean those payments would be tax-free at the federal and state levels. For states that do not automatically follow federal income tax treatment, the authorizing legislation for reparations should include a provision making the receipt tax-free for state income tax purposes. But following a belts and suspenders approach, I would recommend that the state authorizing legislation make clear that any such reparations payments would be received tax-free under the state income tax system. And to the extent you could get a similar provision to the Holocaust and Japanese American reparations treatment included in federal legislation, that would be the most risk-averse way to proceed. Is there a different analysis if the reparations are non-monetary? What if reparations in the form of property are given? To the extent that it was a return of property, the revenue ruling provided us with one potential analysis. But there's an alternative legal analysis that could also lead to tax-free treatment. Let's consider Bruce's Beach. When the family received the land, did they have gross income for federal tax purposes? State legislation made it clear that it would not be taxable for state income tax purposes. But what about federal income tax treatment? For Bruce's Beach, there are equitable doctrines that either the IRS or a court could apply to ensure the receipt would be excluded from gross income and received tax-free. The doctrine of rescission is one possibility. Essentially, the IRS would not recognize the transfer because the initial taking by the state was invalid. The IRS would look at the totality of the transaction and say, considering all the facts and circumstances, they determined that nothing actually happened. The property was taken, but given back. And we will just treat this like the initial improper taking was rescinded. Of course, this relies upon the IRS or, last option, the court system to, quote, do the right thing, close quote. The better approach, in my opinion, is to get a legislative solution that would make it clear the payments were not taxable either at the federal or state level, or to get a private letter ruling or public letter ruling. Finally, I want to reiterate that when you think through how to finance any such reparations payments, you need to carefully consider who pays. Having African Americans pay any part of their reparations would be entirely inconsistent with the intent and spirit of the task force's goals. Recent survey data from the Pew Research Center showed that among all U.S. adults who believe that descendants of people enslaved in the U.S. should be paid reparations, 65% think that businesses and banks that profited from slavery should have all or most of the responsibility for repayment, compared with 53% who think that should be colleges and universities, compared with 44% who think descendants of families who engaged in the slave trade should have all or most of the responsibility for repayment. By the way, 75% think the federal government should have all or most of the responsibility for repayment. Thank you for allowing me to testify today, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Well, my thing is on. So yes, thank you, Member Tamaki, for inviting Sarah Moore Johnson and Raymond Odom. And I want to start with you. If you have any comments or.
Yeah, well, if I can, I'd like to thank Ray Odom for traveling from Chicago and Sarah Johnson traveling from Washington, D.C. That was brilliant testimony. And I would say it's important on a couple levels, 3 levels maybe. First level is certain right-wing media members, as we move toward the repairs, are going to throw out numbers, and they focused on numbers and how enormous they are. But from the testimony from Mr. Odom and Ms. Johnson, you could see that the government support, I'll call it welfare for the ultra wealthy, not just the wealthy, the ultra wealthy, is exorbitant. It's extreme. The number that struck me was in year 2000, if a family members, husband and wife, say had $675,000 in wealth, they could pass at least that much on to their children tax-free. And so after that, it increased dramatically. So as we sit in the audience here, what is an acceptable level to transfer to your kids? Is it 675,000? Is it $1 million? Is it 5 million? Is it 10 million? And the testimony of Sarah Johnson indicated that by 2023, it is a husband and wife can transfer almost $26 million tax-free. And it's led to this huge concentration of wealth and income inequality, and also widen the wealth gap. So I think from a counter-narrative point of view, in terms of who's benefited from the system and the amount of repairs that are needed, I think that is a data point that we should be talking about in terms of how the system currently works to concentrate wealth in especially ultra-white taxpayers. I guess the second piece is what we as task force members should be telling our congressional delegation and the Senate delegation about recommendations on tax policy. And we heard 2 suggestions. Certainly reform of the estate tax code, which is way beyond what it was traditionally and historically. And then the second thing is new devices to allow charitable contributions toward this end. Now, admittedly, that's different from reparations. which is compensation for the harm that's due. And I can't argue with the fact that charity is not reparations. Agreed. But we need to explore, in my humble opinion, every way to funnel monies toward ameliorating the harm that's happened. And I think that's one thing we should be looking at. But that also is that's a federal issue. The state of California legislation doesn't have legal authority over that. That's federal. But it's one of those things. It's not as heavy a lift as getting, congressional, maybe it is as heavy a lift, but I would think it's not as heavy a lift as getting Congress now to pass reparations in the form that we've been talking about. But changes in the tax policy, maybe, and maybe that's one incremental approach, not the only approach, but we should be looking at it. And I think the third thing is what California can do in its own estate policies, and maybe reinstituting what it had, so many years ago. So I just want to thank you for your testimony today. And also I want to thank Dorothy Brown, Professor Brown, for your testimony, Professor Brown, about being mindful, basically, of those issues. Who pays for the taxes, or who pays for reparations, rather, and ways to make sure that it's not taxable. But again, that is also a federal issue that we have to push to our own California Senate and House delegations. So thank you very much.
Hi, thank you so much. Incredibly insightful and just provocative. A lot to think about. Gives us a lot more options. You talked about the baby boomer to the millennial transfer of wealth that we are on the heels of, and how that's probably the most massive transfer of wealth that we're going to see in history. What can you quantify what that's going to do to the racial wealth gap? How that's going to balloon it? Maybe give us some numbers.
But I mean, we know from what we've seen in the past, when exemptions were even lower than they are now, rates were higher than they are now, that being able to pass this level of wealth dramatically increased the racial wealth gap. And so we know, given that our exemptions now have gone up exponentially, I would imagine that the racial wealth gap would also go up exponentially if we don't act to harness some tax revenue from that massive transfer of wealth.
One of the comments I have on that, and just to quote a bit of Professor Brown's book, Whiteness of Wealth, in the African American community, wealth is transferred reverse. It goes up. So it's not that you just have all this massive wealth coming down. What's happening in the Black community is it's going back up to grandparents and other people. So for us, and then by the time the generation of baby boomers that has supported their grandparents and parents die, we have a lot less. So you see, it's a double effect.
Mm-hmm.
It's not only that a lot's going down, concentrated, is a lot's going up, dissipated.
Representing some of the probably most wealthy individuals around in the country, what do you think their mindset would be to propose something? Even though it would save them money, do you think some would push back, being the fact that it would be going toward reparations? Do you think there's an appetite for them if it's?
I think I have to take this one because
Okay.
I work for myself and Ray does not.
Okay. All right.
Ray's got big bank behind him. I will tell you, we live in a very liberal area in Washington, D.C. And what I hear from a lot of my clients is a level of guilt at being able to take this much money and give it to their heirs, and not necessarily wanting to do it, but feeling like they have to do it because the government is allowing them to. And if the government would just lower the exemptions, I think it would alleviate some of the guilt. And I know that's not the case across the board, and that's probably not the case if I travel to different areas of the country. But from where I sit and what I see, I think there would be support for, especially earmarking it to a cause that people could get behind.
You know, carefully, thank you for that, sir. Carefully crafting my comments so I'm not, getting outside the lines. Absolutely great point. Both of your questions were excellent questions. The point is this: I can tell you unequivocally that very, very wealthy people have lots of trouble figuring out what to do with their swollen wealth. I'm just saying it straight. If you don't believe me, go look at Warren Buffett's pledge. Go look at their pledge. Go look at what Zuckerberg has done. They're careful. They're trying to figure out, what do I do? It's very difficult. You can make a full career out of helping people figure out what to do with what they don't know what to do with, right? So the point is, and that's for a second thing, is the charitable incentives. This is the interesting thing about estate tax. Just to prove my ultimate point that this tax was for redistributing wealth. Think about this. The estate tax is the only tax, federal tax that I'm aware of. Professor might know of others, but the only tax that you get a choice to avoid entirely. One more time. It is a tax that you can avoid entirely. All you have to do is set your money up into a private foundation or other charities. If you look around, you will see huge foundations. I don't want to use any names, but you can use them. And you say, why would they set up this big board? Yes, because there you go, because you use the name. So, but the point of it is that all they were saying is, okay, I know I can't do this with it. I don't want to get that, so I'll just do this. And that's why I'm saying, if we could begin the public policy sentiment, it just changes. Just like there was public policy towards when Carnegie died, libraries. That was his big thing. Just like the public policy toward the arts. There could be public policy for repaying a debt of the government. Remember what I said? Repaying a debt. If you're not being benevolent, you're repaying a debt, but you're helping us to get rid of our deficit by doing that. Does that answer your question?
I look to say, I like Olive said, this has been very comprehensive, very informative. I think it's very powerful. And I think as a legislator, the takeaway is we can afford it, or it can be afforded. And that's so often we hear, how do we pay for it? I think you guys given us a clear roadmap. When you look at 1% of the population, you say have $34 trillion. We can afford it. So,
and you know what? I know one thing about that. All those people, yeah, they're gonna die.
Yeah. Well, I'm
just saying. Not gonna be rude.
And for those ones who think it's not their responsibility, as I say, if you can inherit generational wealth, you can inherit generational debt. So this is a debt that's owed.
Is Professor Brown still on the call, or did she have to drop? Oh, okay. I was going to ask her a question. She was cited in a Bloomberg piece that came out around the Biden administration's first ever analysis of tax return data by race and ethnicity. I'll take the time for you all to give any closing remarks, even if you wanted to talk about that as well.
Well, I think one thing we'll say is that the member Tamaki made the point that charity and reparations are not the same thing. And the ideas that we've been proposing, they fall within the charitable structure of the Internal Revenue Code, but you get a deduction for a contribution to a state government. And as long as you have a public purpose for that, you can get a federal income tax deduction. So conceivably, I, in Washington, D.C., could make a charitable donation, in quotes, to the California Reparations Fund, and I would get a federal income tax deduction. And so you could think bigger.
And I think it's just been a privilege, and like this has been the highlight of my life. And I'll just go ahead, since we're close friends now, and just tell you the reality. When you spend, I'm not even going to tell you, but it's more than 30 years helping wealth get concentrated. Yeah, it's a joy to be able to talk to a group of people who might actually be able to change that for good. And that, I think, is why Bill Gates Sr. and others like him. I actually have talked to very, very wealthy white folks who actually do buy this. But the point of it is I really think that, as Don had mentioned, I think it's so important to set the narrative. And if the narrative isn't around who's getting something for nothing, but what are we going to do about this gross wealth disparity? And I guess my closing thought is that I don't think it's just a matter of this is kind of sort of nice. I actually think when you look at civil unrest, I believe you can do clear data analysis that will show wealth inequity will lead eventually to civil unrest. And I think that's why we'd be doing, in a sense, a favor. And that's not, I mean, that's social science. That's not anything. But I think it's important that people take a personal interest in saying, we need to solve this problem for all of America, but especially for Black Americans. That's all.
Thank you again, Raymond Odom and Sarah Moore Johnson and Professor Dorothy Brown, for your incredible, inspiring, comprehensive expert testimony. We really appreciate it. Yes, Vice Chair Brown, you're recognized.
Let me say that, Vice Chair, I want to thank you for this incredible presentation from all the members of the panel, and sum it up in a quick and a poetic statement. I.A. O'Shaughnessy once said, concentrated wealth is like cow manure that you keep stored in the corner and does nothing but stinks. But you have to spread it around to do something for the common good.
Great. Yeah. That's great. That's fantastic. Okay, thank you so much for that, Vice Chair Brown. So the next item on our agenda is item number 9, discussion and potential action, subpoena advisory committee report and recommendations, presenters, members, Holder, and Tamaki with the DOJ Research Center.
Thank you, Chair Moore. And thank you to the DOJ Research Center for providing the advisory committee with the research that is helping us craft our recommendations regarding the criminal legal system. I'm going to keep this pretty brief, but I do want to give some context as to what the advisory panel is doing and the preliminary recommendations that we are evaluating, putting forward right now, so that people know what direction we're going in, and also so that the task force over the next few weeks can take a look at these recommendations and give us feedback as to what our more final recommendations should look like. So we're just giving you some of our preliminary recommendations based on what we have found out about using our power to compel information from prosecutors' offices. So if I could have the first slide, I'm just going to go through this quickly but systematically. So the task force interim report establishes that the criminal legal system is a sector responsible for some of the most egregious state-sanctioned human rights abuses against Black people. Data tells the story of racial injustice objectively and convincingly. That is why robust, uniform, and strategic data collection is key to rehabilitating California's legal system within the reparations framework. Again, reparations is not just about a check, it's about rehabilitating these systems that have exacted a tremendous amount of harm against Black people. We have to change these systems. The Racial Justice Act is an existing law that can potentially serve as an effective backstop to racial profiling and anti-Black bias in the California criminal legal system if advocates have access to competent prosecutorial data to establish bias. So we need to know, what are these prosecutors doing? What data are they collecting in order for us to know how much bias is occurring in criminal prosecutions? Under the current parameters of the Racial Justice Act, the data collection and transparency requirements are insufficient. The task force is leveraging its mandate to help to strengthen the Racial Justice Act by requiring all California district attorney and city attorney offices and superior courts to disclose the nature of the data collected regarding race at every level of criminal prosecution. The advisory team deployed a survey to gather the information on data collection protocols in each prosecution office and court throughout the state of California. This survey is a preliminary step to inform our recommendations to rehabilitate the criminal legal system within a reparations construct. The summation of the data collection protocol survey shows that data that implicates race is not being collected systematically or uniformly across all prosecutorial offices and courts across the state. Therefore, the task force should recommend fixes to the Racial Justice Act that require greater uniformity in data collection by all prosecutors' offices, city attorneys' offices, and superior courts across the state. The other finding that we made based on the survey is that, based on actually our focused conversations with leading advocates who use the Racial Justice Act, we can draw the conclusion that the Racial Justice Act is undermined by the lack of prosecutor transparency, which blocks advocates' access to data relating to racial bias in prosecutions. To try and correct biased prosecutions, the task force should recommend that systems be put in place to facilitate data transparency. So, our preliminary recommendations, without first getting feedback from the rest of our colleagues on the task force, is that we take the following steps to make sure that the data on race that is being collected is uniform and transparent. Here are the fixes that we recommend to the Racial Justice Act. An enhanced right to discovery in criminal cases where defendants raise Racial Justice Act claims, with a very low threshold for asserting these claims in criminal litigation. We also recommend that there are penalties that deter prosecutors and courts from failing to comply with these procedures about data collection. And specifically, we're recommending that prosecutors who thwart the Racial Justice Act data transparency requirements and engage in discovery violations should be subject to penalties in the form of adverse rulings, jury instructions, and case dismissals. So if you're not being transparent when someone brings a Racial Justice Act claim that their prosecution is systemically biased, then throw the case out of court. If you're trying to hide the ball and not give this information over to defendants who are trying to show that they are being unfairly prosecuted, then juries should be instructed that you're hiding the ball, or judges should start to dismiss these cases. The Racial Justice Act, we should also consider forming a Racial Justice Act Commission, and we would create a commission similar to the RIPA board. And this is the commission that looks at racial profiling in policing. So instead of looking in racial profiling in policing, this commission that we're recommended would be focusing on racial profiling in the prosecution of these cases. So racial profiling in the prosecutor's office and in the adjudication of these cases in superior courts. And this commission could be housed within a Freedmen's Bureau agency down the line. And the commission could do several things. They could establish key performance indicators and other quality control metrics to ensure compliance by prosecutors' offices and courts. They could publish annual reports that disclose some of this prosecutorial bias, and they can establish a federal nexus, which ensures that the data that we're collecting in California about racial bias in prosecution is going up to the federal level, so that we can have a big picture of what racial bias in prosecution looks like all over the country. We need to upload California's data to the federal databases about bias. And then lastly, we're recommending another fix that will increase public oversight of prosecutorial bias. So provide grants, technical assistance, and other resources to watchdog organizations and community-based organizations so that they can begin to build expertise and capacity for Racial Justice Act advocacy and compliance monitoring. And so basically, you'll have community organizations and watchdog groups who are going to serve almost as an overlay to make sure that we are dismantling bias in prosecutor offices, because we're going to be sort of giving them technical assistance to learn how to use the Racial Justice Act in their advocacy, and asking them to sort of act as private attorney generals with skills and infrastructure to leverage public pressure as a quality control for the Racial Justice Act compliance. So these are just some of our preliminary recommendations that are based on the data that we have been able to collect through compelling prosecutors' offices to give us their data information. I'm going to turn it over to Dawn if you have any additions.
No, I think you did a great job in giving an overview. Just to put it simply, we have now a sense of the data that is being collected, but the issue is how you retrieve it. And why would you want this data? Well, if you're a defendant charged in the system, you want to know you're being treated equally and fairly. That it's not, you're not being charged more severely, sentenced longer, denied diversion more because of your race. And so it's a comparative situation where we really need to know that for the same crime, for example, are people being treated the same? And the way you do that is you trace the cases, the charges by race, and you compare the apples and the oranges and seeing apples to apples how it's being treated. And this is the only way we think that the Racial Justice Act will have any meaning, and that is to require the data collection, the transparency of it, and then get it in a situation where it can be retrieved. And some of that might require further legislation down the road. I think this is what we would be considered anyway for software programming that will allow for electronic inquiries to get the information very quickly. But that's basically a little bit of the detail to what Lisa was saying.
Thank you so much for that update, Member Holder and Member Tamaki. As I said in September, I think what you all are doing is pretty groundbreaking, and yeah, so everybody clap for them. And it's a pretty good use of our subpoena power with the limited time that we have. I'll say what I said in September, in that I know this is preliminary recommendations, nothing is set in stone, but this is a communications point. To the extent we can maybe get some press on the work that you two are doing on this, that would be absolutely outstanding. Any other comments? Member Montgomery Stepp, you're recognized.
Thank you. I just also want to say thank you, and specifically to recommendation number 2 with the enforcement mechanisms. I think that that's very, very important. Prosecutors will not change the way they do things unless they're mandated to do that, and unless they face those penalties. I like the fact that you put fiscal penalties in here, and adverse rulings, of course. But I just wanted to comment on that. Probably that's, in my mind, one of the most important recommendations and important ways to actually change the systems, to not reward what has been continuing in the system. So thank you for that.
If there aren't any other questions, we can move on to the next item on our agenda, which is item number 10. Discussion and potential action, Communications Advisory Committee comments and communications firm, implementation plan updates and outcomes, presenters, Member Lewis, Bradford, and Charles Group representatives.
Let's see. Hello, good afternoon. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
All
And
right,
if
perfect.
task force members have comments or questions, do we wait until the end or do we raise them as we go along? Which would you prefer?
I want to get through the beginning, and then when we move to the PowerPoint, there will be some discussion around that. This time is really meant to go over the master PowerPoint that we created, that we were asked to create in the December meeting. But before that, I'd like to give just a high-level update of some of the work that we've been doing since the December meeting until now, and an idea of what we have planned. Does that work for everyone?
Yeah, that works. You can proceed.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Good afternoon. I am Dr. Shauna Charles of the Charles Communication Group. And as I stated previously, just want to give an update of some of our January activities and talk about some of the things that we are potentially planning moving forward, and then review the master PowerPoint for feedback from the task force members so that we can move forward and make any updates and begin to distribute the PowerPoint through DOJ. So really quickly, some of the things that we have done is that we've really been working with the media. We've been booking and coordinating media interviews for various task force members. We've been conducting a targeted media outreach, especially for the San Diego public meeting or public hearing. We've been doing some coaching and media messaging around just sharing information about the task force, about reparations. We developed some social media content, and we are waiting to get feedback from the comms committee to be able to share that with the entire task force for approval. Next slide, please. We begin to initiate and explore some planning for February, which is Black History Month, and some activities that we could do there in collaborations, as well as a potential May event around the report and any educational events that we can execute. And of course, today we want to talk about the master PowerPoint that we have developed and received any feedback and comments from task force members so that we can make any updates or changes so that this can be utilized to share the great work that the task force is doing. Next slide, please. So before we move into this, I just want to talk a little bit about how we developed this material. We prepared the PowerPoint using the content and verbiage that has already been approved and reviewed by the task force in earlier documents. We leveraged the DOJ website, task force communication documents, as well as the interim report. This presentation is to provide key points of the executive summary. If the format that we have presented is approved, it can be developed in collaboration with task force members individually. But what we want to make clear is that if we make any changes or additions to the presentation, that it will then become a personal statement rather than a task force statement or represent the entire task force. We also provided details in the slide notes to help facilitate deeper discussion and emphasize points. And of course, we can tailor that with task force members as they're going out and talking about the areas that they're supporting. And we made sure to provide a side-by-side view of what's happening nationally, as well as what California's role is in this. We also incorporated the key findings of the task force, and we just wanted to make sure that we represented this in a way that was cohesive and that could be understood by, easily understood by the public about the work that the task force is doing. Next slide, please. So I think with that, we can actually go into the PowerPoint and we can start the discussion there. So if you can go to the first slide of that, unless the task force members have any questions before we do that. I'm not really sure, Michael, how you guys want to facilitate this. We will take the notes and the changes. And of course, task force members, you guys can reach out to us if you want to tailor something specifically for your needs. And we will make sure we get those changes and figure out how we work alongside doing that. Any questions, comments?
I have a comment before we proceed. So the document that was downloaded to the public for public materials, the statute was spelled incorrectly, and there was a wrong number. It was 3132. So I would just make a friendly comment. When we're preparing materials, let's make sure they are, accurate, because again, still in the presentation that you just presented, the last slide, statute was spelled incorrectly. And then again, on the materials that was published to the public this morning, it said AB 132, which is not the statute.
We caught that, and we actually had that change.
Yes, but
thank you for that feedback.
So let's make sure we spell statute correctly in our future materials. Proceed.
We will make sure, but thank you for the set of eyes. All right, so we can move forward. Again, I'm not sure how we want to facilitate the conversation. Are there any ideas or thoughts about how we do that?
I think you should just proceed.
Okay, next slide, please. So we wanted to give an opening of the assembly bill and just a high-level overview. I'm not going to go into all the detail because, like I said previously, we really took this directly from the intern report and previous material. And we just want to use the time for you all to see the feedback and give any thoughts around the feedback and how we decide to move forward. The content is pretty straightforward. We didn't make any changes to anything. We wanted to make sure we kept in alignment with the information that was already approved and accepted. So I think we can just roll through this. And then I believe DOJ will be sharing the PowerPoint presentation with all of you. And then we can, get notes or feedback if any of you want to have an individual discussion or use this or any part of it for the work that you want to do.
Girls, you're recognized.
When we were asked if we had any suggestions on how to go through this, I actually had raised my hand. When we have already been given this material in advance. We were asked to take a look at it in advance because of the length of the material. And I think that it would be more efficient if, rather than we go through every single slide, that task force members can indicate particular slides where they had feedback. Otherwise, I think this would be a challenging approach.
Okay, we can do that. So I have a comment. So it's 2 slides after this one. It starts off by the 9-member task force. You can fast forward to that one. All right, so for this one, I had an issue with this because as the Trials Communication Group noted, much of this material is simply copied and pasted from the statute. However, on this slide, right, if you notice for each bullet point, African Americans have been supplanted with Black Americans, and that's not in the statute. And so when we're talking about statutory language, if we're going to simply lift language from a statute, then we need to keep the language that's in the statute. When we're talking about statutory language, the change of any word in a statute could truly change the scope and the intent of the statute. So my general comment is that this language in terms of Black Americans needs to be reverted back to the language that's in the statute, which is African Americans. So that's my comment on that slide. Also, any other, I have a lot of comments. So we can fast forward to the task force timeline slide. So I think this is a good slide. However, when we're talking about a timeline, I think it's important to insert times or dates for each point. So to the extent that we can do that, that would be fantastic. So I noticed that there's dates or times assigned for three or of the 6 points. I would want the Charles Communication Group to do more background research, do what needs to be done to put dates and times on the different bullet points that they have identified for this slide.
Okay.
Not on. Am I on now?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm trying to understand for that particular slide, why is it, we were appointed at probably about the same time. Why is it so important to have the specific date? It's in the right about the timeline. And I don't mind putting it in there, but I'm curious as to why you want specificity for that particular one.
Difference of opinion, I guess it's just a difference of style and expectation.
Okay. I know you could list a bunch of times of dates when different people were appointed.
I think the goal here is to keep things as clean and as simple as possible. This is very much a lot of information, and we were trying to extract to make it easily digestible for the people that would be consuming it, who may not know much about the task force and may not know much about the work that the task force is doing. But we are more than happy to hear everyone's feedback. I'm not sure how we come into agreement on things, but we're willing to do what is necessary to get the job done.
Okay, and if we can go back to the timeline slide, I just think in general, the universal comment is that things need to be more clear. So the third bullet point, California reparation community listening sessions and expert testimony conducted. For one, we heard from people who provided personal and expert testimony. So personal testimony isn't reflected in this timeline. So I'm not sure why, but that needs to be changed to reflect that we heard from over 100 people who provided both personal and expert testimony, not just expert testimony.
Okay, that can be updated.
And the second to last bullet point on communication and education of the California public on the availability of the interim report and its findings. It's fine. I mean, it's an ongoing thing, but in general, my points on the timeline are that one, if we could put more dates onto the timeline, that would be great. Understanding Member Bradford and Member Holder's point, Member Jones Sawyer's point, but then also it needs to be updated to reflect that we heard not only from expert witnesses, but people who provided their personal testimony as well.
Okay, we will make that update. Thank you.
If we can go a slide before the timeline. So, number one, the task force must issue an interim reparations report, and then the bullet next to it is the first phase of an extensive process before the bill is presented to both houses. Can you clarify what you mean by the bill?
No, I cannot clarify that. But do you have something you would like me to say?
Thank you, Mitchell. Really appreciate that.
Take the mic.
This just is, that bullet is just to reinforce that the final report that the task force is going to issue is a recommendation to the legislature. And that begins a new process where it has to move forward as a bill. So.
But her point is, point of clarification, this task force makes recommendations
Correct.
to the, so maybe bills should not be there, should be recommendations presented to both houses and the governor for potential legislation and bills and budget things to be done.
Point taken.
This body does not have the authority, legislative authority. That I believe that's what the chair is getting at.
Will do.
Thank you. So those were essentially all of my comments after the review of this presentation. So you can proceed.
I'm sorry, you have delivered all of your feedback?
I think for now.
Okay. All right, that's great.
Well, I have a clarifying question, and I want to ask Member Montgomery Stepp. You asked for the Charles Communications Group to prepare PowerPoints to correspond for each chapter in the report, to which Charles Communication Group said they would send us something by mid-January. And so I just want to kind of clarify with you in terms of when you reviewed this material, does this meet the vision that you had when you first made the request?
I think my request was a reaction to something that was presented to us by the firm during that presentation. So I think that my point was, if we had a base document that based on, whatever our own capacities were, based on whatever our own expertise was, or how we decided to present it, that we would have, just almost a generic document to begin to do that work with. That was I didn't necessarily have a strong vision for it, honestly. I think it was a reaction to the desire to have something to work with when we are asked by our communities to give the information and update as to what we have been doing. So I don't have any necessarily any feedback at this time based on what's before us. Well, my idea was that we would take it individually, and based on whether we would use it or not, we could kind of tweak it the way that we wanted to within the parameters of the messaging and things that we have discussed.
Chair Moore, maybe a good comment. So I also thank you. I also requested some form of PowerPoint as soon as possible. And the reason is, I think all of us, but I know for me, I'm speaking to largely non-African American groups, maybe once or even twice a week. And to give an overview of the 500-page, this monumental report, it's helpful to have a PowerPoint. And so this distillation looks pretty good to me, frankly. And what it needs that can be easily added is images and some graphics to make it sort of more easily readable. But the key things that I would want to emphasize as head points or headlines is you're typically, these presentations maybe an hour or less, is to be able to flip through the slides and to do the interim report some justice in explaining it. And so the contents is taken from the interim reports. I was satisfied certainly about that. The only thing I would add is graphics, and if there are some sections that are pretty text heavy, that might be further reduced. That would be a great idea, because I tend to use the head point and then explain it orally, but the points are all there. So I think it's a very helpful tool.
Thank you, Don. And this PowerPoint really was the initial draft that we wanted to share. We will and do plan on adding graphics and making it more visually appealing, but we wanted to make sure that the content was approved and how we delivered the content was approved, and we wanted to get feedback from all of you on that. And then, yes, of course, we can update it with visualizations and we can share that, and then also work with any individual member of the task force who wants to have any updates. But please remember, once you do that, it becomes a personal statement for you and doesn't represent the task force as a whole. So thank you, Don.
Thank you for that. And to clarify, will the future PowerPoint presentation, will it still be just one slide for each chapter with just some graphics added in? Is that what you're saying?
Is it requested that there be a PowerPoint for each chapter? Or are we looking at having this master PowerPoint and individuals being able to adapt what they want from the master PowerPoint? Because if so, that's going to be what, about 13 different PowerPoints?
So Chair Moore, I may be able to give a little bit of clarity to guide the discussion. So each of the members of the task force can speak to their own positions and opinions with regard to especially the chapters they're working on or the work they're doing on the task force. The task force, however, you can only speak on behalf of the task force with something that's been pre-approved to speak for the task force as a whole. So each member has their own opinions, but only the task force can speak for the task force. This PowerPoint is designed to facilitate each of you being able to sort of speak on behalf of the task force with a prepared document that the task force as a whole has reviewed and approved, and then you can each layer on whatever information you want to add in a given presentation as your own opinions that you're doing. So that's the point of this PowerPoint, is a baseline.
Recognize.
Well, for one, I appreciate the brevity in each of the slides and the kind of lifting up of some key findings, because oftentimes we're not going to have enough time to go into detail, and definitely not doing a deep dive on any given chapter unless that is a particular focus for some kind of presentation or interview. That all being said, some of us are more familiar with certain chapters' content than others. And I just wanted to ask whether or not, because this is a PDF version, at the end of the day, will we get the PowerPoint version? And in that PowerPoint version, are there any additional notes in the notes section for us that can help explain some of the things that are here?
So yes, Dr. Grills, thank you for that. I'm not sure how we can distribute this. I think that would be up to DOJ, but yes, we can send it in a PowerPoint version. And yes, there are additional notes, I call them starter notes at the bottom. And then of course you can tailor that to your level of comfort or how you like to drive your conversation.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, my last note is that, but for everything that's been lifted from the interim report in the statute, right, there are a lot of proofreading errors, just quite frankly. So, if this is going out to members of the public, if we're going to be distributing this to our personal networks, I am making the request publicly that extra care is taken in terms of proofreading. That is essential. Yes, you are recognized.
All right, here we go. No? All right. Okay, thank you. So I think it's just important just to remember that, the purpose of this PowerPoint is for use for task force members. So when task force members are asked to go and present on the work of the task force, this is what this PowerPoint is for. And so what Sean is asking for is basically for, general overview feedback on the content, to make sure that if each of us or any of us go out and present on the material of the interim report, that we all agree that what we have decided to present on, is here, and, to provide any feedback on what we might think is missing. So I think, exactly some of the feedback about the language and the terms, such as African American, we want to make sure that there's consistency, because we can imagine that different members on the task force would use different vocabulary. And when you're speaking on behalf of the task force, you have to use the right terminology, and use it consistently. So I think it's good to have that. And so I just wanted to kind of make sure this is understood by everybody on the task force and by the public as well, that this is not necessarily meant to be a kind of publicly, disseminated presentation, say, to put online or something like that. This is for when we get asked to represent the task force at an event or something like that, that we are all basically, this one is for you, Dr. Brown, singing from the same hymn book. No, okay. Pastor, hymn book. All right. So okay. So I think just to clarify, because I think there might be some misunderstanding about what the use is, and I know Michael tried to explain just now what the kind of use of this is. What I would say is I would just echo, however we can, I think, kind of condense some of the slides. I know it's difficult. We did produce a 500-page, so to bring it down to a 40 slide thing, and I'm a professor, so I know I'm guilty. My lectures always run over. So I know exactly this particular struggle, but I do think, to Don's point, if we can have something that is, edited, where each bullet, for example, perhaps can be, reduced somewhat with, perhaps a closer editing of the language for greater brevity. Yeah. I mean, it's appropriate. It's appropriate. It's appropriate. We know how to do other things too, like reparations, So if we could maybe, see another draft at some stage where we can have, not just the visuals, but also, just a, slides with perhaps more concise language, that would be helpful. And, as a member of the communications advisory group, I'm happy to kind of go over, some of those revisions. And as a person who, as I mentioned, constantly struggles with creating brief PowerPoint slides for lectures, I'm happy to do so as well.
Thank you, Professor Lewis. We will definitely lean on you for your feedback.
That's why I avoid PowerPoints altogether. I don't even do them.
Well, it was a request. We don't have a choice.
Yeah, I know.
Then we must do what is requested.
This slide here, as an example, I think the agenda says appropriately that we are charged, to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans, and it says the task force must issue an interim reparations report. The interim piece was something we made a decision as a task force at the time, but we are ultimately charged with the reparations proposal. So that would be one thing that I think needs to be changed, because that is not quite accurate as far as what we ultimately must do, what the bill charges us to do. So I would add that, if it makes sense.
It makes sense, and we can definitely update this to change it and definitely to add it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Are there any other questions or comments or feedback?
What Dr. Javon Scott Lewis stated, I appreciate the volume of communications that my office has received since our last in-person meeting. So it's a lot of information here, and I thank you for reaching out to my office and me and my staff directly to help shape this. So I will take some ownership if we've missed something as well, because we did get a chance to review it, but it's a lot of information. So thank you for those areas that we need to correct and make sure we have a document that we're all comfortable with going forward. All right.
Thank you, Senator Bradford. Are there any other questions, comments, feedback? All right, well, that concludes, I guess, our portion. You all in the task force know how to reach out to me, and I look forward to moving forward. Thank you.
I have a question. It's not related to the PowerPoint though. So when are we going to get, because Black History Month is a few days away. So when are we going to get a bit more detail about the potential planning for this February Black History Month event?
It's in the initial phases, so let me get back to you offline. I don't want to commit to something in the public that we can't meet, so I will get back to you. I'll talk to the comms committee and we can move forward from there.
And then the follow-up question I have is around the social media content and calendar. Again, I know it's all preliminary, but does the calendar include any, for instance, like audio-visual content, animation? Can we get a little preview of what that might look like?
So I'm not going to share a preview because I don't have that for you, but it does include various posts. It will have potentially some animation in it, and we have not done audio in the sense of voice, but of course, with technology, we can have it read the captions and or information. So we'll be using it that way for the social media. Did that answer your question?
Yes, that sounds so promising. Thank you. And then I guess I have one last procedural question for the DOJ. So thank you so much, Shauna and Mitchell. Final question. Okay, so the UCLA Bunch Center hired the Child's Communications Group with the recommendation of Reggie Jones Sawyer. Me and Dr. Grills, we were once on the Communications Advisory Committee in the December hearing. We were essentially swapped out for Member Jovan Scott Lewis and Senator Bradford. However, I wanted to get some clarity for the sake of the benefit of the public. Although, Dr. Grills elected to remove herself from the committee, and I also voted in the affirmative for that to ensure that Bradford and Member Jovan Scott Lewis are now the committee members working with Child's Communication Group. I just want to get some clarity again for the task force members and the benefit of the public around this issue around the sole designee. So even though Dr. Gross has elected to take herself out of the Communications Advisory Committee, you're still in the picture as a sole designee for the UCLA Bunch Center, correct? And so I wanted to get some clarity either from the DOJ, Member Grills, or the both of you around what that actually means.
So under the Bagley-Keene Act, once somebody is voted to be a sole designee or on an advisory committee, they continue to serve in that role until there is another vote that undoes that first vote. So yes, and this is the Bunch Center contract is really a sole designee for the purpose of contracting and coordinating with the Bunch Center as a contractor for our office. And that includes everything from whether an invoice has come in to whether they're doing some other component of their work or any number of other activities that could happen with the contractor. And so that's one thing. And then the advisory committee is responsible for carrying out the work of the task force with regard to communications, working directly with Charles Group. So it's two different components, two different functions.
Clarify what exactly is Dr. Grill's role as sole designee as it relates to communications?
As it relates to communications, well, I communicate with her about the Bunch Center.
She's the sole authority to provide direction to the Bunch Center around communications. That sounds familiar, that language?
No, I guess so the Communications Advisory Committee is responsible for engaging in any activity on behalf of the task force with regard to communications, meaning working with the Charles Group with regard to any press inquiries that come in, or developing this PowerPoint or other things about communication with the public regarding the work of the task force. And so in that regard, that's the Communications Advisory Committee work. Dr. Grills was designated to help manage the contracting of the Bunch Center, which is a very complicated process because it's in an interagency agreement between the DOJ and UCLA for services. So it's not only was it on the front end of a complicated process, but we're dealing with things like invoicing and finalization of the report and ownership of the copyright and transferal of the report and incorporating that into the task force's final report. So there's a whole lot of stuff that, Bunch Center primarily is all of that stuff. The communications firm, frankly, is something the Bunch Center agreed to do sort of at the tail end after as a sort of addendum to what they were already working on. And so at this juncture, other than obviously paying for invoices and things like that, which the DOJ is processing, the Communications Advisory Committee is solely responsible for communications.
On that? Okay, great. Senator Bradford, Member Jovan Scott Lewis.
Right. Well, thanks for asking the question so we could understand exactly how the full transition of, the relationship between the advisory group and the new advisory group and the communications firm has been set up and what it means going forward. So, on that basis, I just want to provide just some brief guidance to my colleagues on the task force around, public engagement. So we understand that individual members of the task force are, in communication with the public and with the media, and speak on behalf of what is happening with the task force. But there is, I think a regular occurrence in which, those contacts and those engagements are being done outside of the purview or the awareness of the communications team broadly, meaning Charles Group as well as Senator Bradford and myself. And this has been going on from before, where Member Grills and Chair Moore, when they were the communications advisory group. So what we're asking is that if individual members of the task force are contacted, to do any kind of public events or to provide any kind of, public comment, that Shauna basically and the Charles Group are looped in to, those agreements, right? And that could be as simple as just copying, Shauna and her group on that correspondence. The reason being is that oftentimes we've seen that individual task force members have been asked for public comment, have been asked to attend events and to participate. And they're giving opinions, they're, and rightfully so, representing themselves. However, sometimes what we found is things are being reported, inaccurately. And then, the Charles Group then has to kind of come behind and put out fires, really without having any sense that, there was a fire to be put out in the first place, because they were unaware that individual members were actually engaging with the public or with the media in any particular way. And so just to be clear, I'm not, suggesting that, individually we stop taking requests to speak to the media. That's been the kind of practice from day one. That's entirely fine. We all have different relationships, different networks, and we want to make sure that we are casting a broad as net as possible in terms of, amplifying the work that we're doing and the need for reparatory justice. But as far as just the need to be made aware of what's happening, one, so we can have a catalog of activities amongst the task force so that the communications group can provide support where needed, where appropriate, but also can be, just simply aware of what's happening so that on the occasion, and we've seen it happen increasingly, that there is need, for some kind of, what's the word? Anyway, it is too late. Another coffee is needed. The retraction. Thank you, ma'am. if we can have, you know, there are moments where we need support with issues like retractions, with, you know, like the whole thing with the Daily Mail that I think a member of the public brought up earlier, right? A lot of that was you know, really the result of the Daily Mail and other media outlets picking up something that a task force member said, not out of context, but making it out of context, right? But however, you know, the Charles group or the communications, you know, team wasn't aware, right, that a task force member was actually speaking to the media. Had they been aware, then they could at least have, you know, kept any potential issue on their radar, right? And so again, what we're asking for is just that we have, you know, some transparency and some communication, you know, to provide awareness to the communications team so that we know exactly how our task force colleagues are making impact, and so that way we can provide support when needed. And so again, what that looks like is simply, you know, someone emails you, asks you to do an interview. Someone emails you and asks and invites you to attend an event. You can simply reply in whichever manner you feel appropriate, yes or no, but you should at least just simply copy Shauna on the email so that way she at least knows what's happening and can provide support again where and when needed.
Thank you, Professor Lewis.
Oh, she can't say. You're welcome.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments, questions? Okay, great. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
For coordination, because as we reach out to other groups, they are planning events and support, you know, they're building a movement. So I think that the Task Force Comms Committee should know about at least what's going on outside. And then to the extent there's a mutual amplification and coordination that is also pretty important.
You hear me now? Just a point of clarification. We had some challenges, and this is the communications part is a very challenging and demanding part of this whole procedure. We've had several communication firms that have come and gone, just trying to work with this task force and committee. I became aware of the Charles group, and they were willing to go ahead and come into this environment, knowing how challenging it can sometimes be. I'll be quite frank with you. I warned her that you want to come into this. It's great that we have somebody. I think she's done a fabulous job. I didn't necessarily recommend her, but I'm extremely happy that the two were able to find one another, the Bunch Center and herself, and that they were able to work through this and get her on board, because now is the time that we need to move forward. Her capacity to, as you can hear even today, to just work with us to get us to the next level. She has the patience of Job, and I'm extremely impressed with it, and we should be impressed with it as we move forward, because we're now, as I said before, at the meat and potatoes of what we need to do. And as far as getting the communications out, if we need to get it done now, and we need it done quickly, we need it done fast. She's under some restrictions that she doesn't tell people about, but it's DOJ restrictions, and we're going to try to do some workarounds and do as best we can to do what we can under the legislative and state requirements that we're under. So just bear with us as we move forward, through not only to Black History Month, but as we move forward and to get to that final day of June 30th, 2023.
DOJ, can you clarify what are the restrictions that she's under?
Sure. Also known as the law, but you know, we have advised on communications with the members and us as the DOJ staff with regard to privileges and confidentiality issues, as well as the fact that there are certain things that are not provided for within the legislative purview of the task force. In other words, what's not in this statute is not permissible to the task force. It's only what the legislature granted to the task force in its advisory role to the legislature. Is that sound right to you, Member Jones Sawyer?
It's like, for example, people are asking for billboards, people are asking for websites, people are asking all the things that people, you know, it's not fair to this body here. It's not fair to the Charles Group. I would say it's not fair to people out here who are wondering what the heck's going on. And so I think we got to finally make that clear. Sure. What's going on.
Absolutely. So yes. Why don't we have a Twitter? Yeah. So yes, the task force statute, AB 3121, sets forth the scope of the task force's work. And we do have a public education and communication committee who are both carrying out the work of communicating about the work of the task force. All of that is subject to a couple of requirements. One is appropriation, and there is not an appropriation for things like billboards or other kinds of public advertising. It also is not within the sort of express scope of what the task force can speak to. The task force is not really set up to be or permitted to be a lobbying organization or similar to that, where they can advocate. The role of the task force is to provide advice directly to the legislature, and then provide education to the public about that advice. And the scope of that does not allow for some of these other items like advertising, like lobbying. We've talked about previously that it also doesn't include things like writing a letter on behalf of the state of California, endorsing federal reparations, but there can be a recommendation that the legislature enact a sense of the legislature bill that would give that sense of the legislature on behalf of the state of California. Essentially, because of the way the task force is set up, all of the actions have to run back through the legislature. And so,
like a website, so we couldn't have our own separate website.
Yes, the website that is run is a website that is the website of the task force, the official website of the task force as a governmental body. Which is hosted by the Department of Justice's website, but there's no provision, just like there aren't provisions for other sort of state agencies to have a sort of a privately operated website. This is a governmental body that is advising the legislature. Your website is the government website.
It's embedded in DOJ, and you have to go into DOJ to find it.
That's correct. The task force has the ability in the recommendations to make recommendations along the line of setting up some kind of other outlet for people to be able to communicate back, whether that's through existing state bureaucracy, which Member Jones Sawyer mentioned before, with regard to bureaucracy and how this continues forward after this. But those are things that would be subject to the recommendations, and then it would be subject to whatever proposed legislation there is, and then whatever fiscal augmentation there is for this. But things like, we know that the governor has an official Twitter. We know that the Attorney General has one, and those other bodies do, but there's no way for the task force to speak with one voice on Twitter. Whereas each of you have your own Twitter or your own official accounts of Twitter, and you can all speak to your own viewpoints or what's happening in the task force on your own behalf. There's no way for the task force to speak sort of in that real time in the same way that an individual elected official or individual, commissioner would be able to.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yes. Thank you, Michael. I just want to say too, that also goes with social media. So the goal is to provide a repository of content that any member of the task force can use, but it will be up to you to use your personal outlets to share that information. And so one of the things we're trying to figure out is how to get you that information to be able to use it at your own discretion and to share that out as you see necessary.
Fantastic, thank you. And we discussed the confines that CCG is under at our last hearing, and I'm aware of that as well as once on the committee. I'll just end by saying, this is particularly catered to the descendant community, the community of eligibility, right? We deserve quality, right? Not only do we deserve quality, I just want to say again to the community of eligibility, nothing is wrong with having high expectations. Also, not only that, high expectations does not necessarily mean unreasonable expectations. In fact, they don't. It just means high expectations. So many of us in the community of eligibility, we have high expectations in our personal life, in our professional life, and I have even higher expectations leading the first state in the nation studying developing reparations proposals for African Americans. So just hold that, people, hold that. Nothing is wrong with having high expectations. Thank you. And with that, we'll go to a break and we'll resume at 4:20 to go to the municipal leader efforts. Thank you.
I can make it short. So before we go to break, sorry, folks. Excuse me, before we go to break, this will be very, very short. We're like a half an hour behind, so I'll keep this very brief. So at the Oakland hearing, I presented sort of an outline of what public education might look like. And the centerpiece of that, not the only piece, but one of the main pieces is how to take this monumental report and turn it into curriculum. And I don't have to tell anybody on the task force or in the room how this is a major issue in the whole nation. In 37 states, there either passed or pending legislation telling teachers how to teach history or not to teach it at all. And so the curriculum report is a tremendous achievement. We think it should be turned into curriculum. And curriculum in the broadest sense, certainly K through 12, but also online curriculum, also on curriculum that could be used in modules for teaching in colleges and universities, and also in non-educational institutional teaching, such as in newsrooms or with policymakers and so on, and then in different forms. As I said, one is online, but wouldn't rule out documentary films and social media shorts kind of thing. It could even involve creation of graphic, works and literary and dramatic works. So, but to start, we have been in communications with a UC Berkeley professor of education, and have a lead on another who's a professor at UC Davis. And the hope is that we can get a proposal scope from them soon, and then begin the contracting process. And in the last meeting in Oakland, this task force authorized the Department of Justice to proceed to engage in the curriculum developer. So that is in the works, and I hope by our February meeting, I'll be able to report out more. But I think once we develop that sort of base curriculum approach, I think it will lead to all kinds of other creative works that will be teaching instruments. Just to clarify, we obviously sunset, we go out of business on June 30th, 2023. And curriculum development, to develop great curriculum, takes a long time. And it'll certainly go well beyond our sunset date. So I just want to report that after we engage the curriculum development developer, normally if it was doing work within the lifetime of the task force, the design team, put it that way, because it'll be more than one person, would be reporting to the task force. But after we go out of existence, consultants will be reporting to the Department of Justice, who will be carrying out the will of the task force and as of the direction we set. So in the recommendations on public education, among them will be including how this curriculum development work is going to be carried out, the goals, the purposes, the values, how it's going to be implemented after we end. And so I just want to announce that. The third thing I want to mention is we're dealing with basically educational components, and also, as Michael Newman had mentioned, some of this may be budgeted, some not. And so I'd like to add and make a motion to add, if she's willing, Cheryl Grills to join me in the public education team for the following purposes. Cheryl's a professor, many years experience in teaching and working in curriculum, also a tremendous source of private money that could help this process. And by that, I mean, of course, the main stuff will be K-12 curriculum, but to turn it into other forms of teaching instruments. That's probably going to require outside money that the state hasn't appropriated for our purposes here. And so I think she's already done that with other activities of the task force. And so I need that professional educational skill and expertise as we work through this curriculum building process. So I'd like to make that motion and ask that one task force member make a second of that. And I hope, Cheryl, you would agree that you would have time.
Chair, before we act on that, let me just say, friends, no curriculum, in my estimation, is going to do anything to give us traction and outcomes unless we have teachers who are more than dealing with some paper and pen and are freed from their implicit bias against us because of the color of our skin. And my prayer and hope is that we not engage in a lot of hoops and procedures. And at the end of the day, you still have what we have now, and that is people who don't look like us, who are in charge, who are in schools, who are superintendents, who are teachers. And I hope that we will be cognizant of that. It's what we can be and not what we have in terms of paper and curriculum. Down there in Florida, what is happening right now? That sorry man is making it against the law. And one school in Ocala, Florida, just last week, you know what happened? They were sending out a form to parents inquiring whether or not their children could learn our national hymn, Lift Every Voice and Sing. Did you hear what I said? The hymn that J. Weldon Johnson wrote, that was the first poem, his brother James Weldon Johnson, his brother Roseman, set it to music. And even many of our children in schools don't know what key to sing it in. Can't sing their way out of a torn paper bag. But we used to sing it, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, even though we were in segregated schools. So I hope and trust that even with the agency and the help of a curriculum, we're always aware what time it is, where we are, and who are the folks we are dealing with in these United States of America and California. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Everything that Pastor Brown said is 100% correct. The Education Advisory Committee, on which we both sit, there are a number of recommendations to include recruitment of Black teachers, financial support to get them in the pipeline, and monies that be directed to underserved communities in education specifically, and also ways for retention, and also anti-bias training, the implicit bias, aspect of it. And I would say the curriculum that we're talking about, there would really be two curriculums, one for, of course, the students, but the other one for the teachers. We need to have a curriculum to teach the teachers as to how to teach this material. So I totally agree with Reverend Brown, and I appreciate the fact that he's been pushing this within our own education committee, and it'll end up in the final recommendations.
Member Tamaki made a motion. I thought when you called on Vice Chair Brown that he was going to second the motion. That didn't happen. He went into discussion. So I would ask that Member Tamaki restate his motion and that you carry it through with the, with a second or not, asking for a second.
Thank you.
So that we can proceed. Thank you.
I would move to add Member Cheryl Grills to the Public Education Advisory Committee and respectfully request a second.
What did he say?
Joan Sawyer, put Joan Sawyer as the second. They all talk at the same time.
Thank you.
Backup materials as far as the recommendation is concerned. I may have missed it. Receive anything in writing?
Oh, there is a PowerPoint with the materials. Is that what you're saying with respect to curriculum?
For this meeting.
Oh, for this meeting, no.
Okay. I would just, this happened also in December where I know that there are some motions that come on the floor. You can't prepare for everything, but if there is a ahead of time recommendation, it would be good to have that so that we would know in the event that we have any questions or anything that we can think about over a few days.
Yes.
So that we can make the most informed decision. I would just request
Apologies and noted. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Agreed. It takes a lot to consider a motion like this. So I don't know if honestly this is proper to kind of just fast track this motion. We can do it, but honestly, it seems like it affords a bit more discussion than that we have allotted at this particular moment.
Well, I need help, honestly, in this, and I need expertise, and I need, particular expertise, and I'd like to get the funding exploration begin right away. And all of this is driven by the fact that we're out of business. In fact, by March, we really have to finalize our recommendations because they then have to be edited and published. So it's even a faster timeline than June. So I appreciate the fact that there is limited discussion, admittedly, but I would ask ask that the task force consider that into account, that we have to move quickly.
Sure. And the only other note I have, and we can, go to Parliamentarian Johnson, when we're talking about private money, that also kind of makes me a little nervous. I don't know what I'm signing up for when we don't know what private entities are involved. Maybe you can talk to it. Dr. Grills, are there some private entities that you're willing to name right now that may be willing to support in this effort? Can you speak to the private entities that you have engaged with in the past during your work as a task force member, particularly for the communications piece?
It wasn't just for the communications piece, it was for the community engagement and communications piece. And the funders were the California Wellness Foundation, the Weingart Foundation, and I'd have to go look and see if there was a third one.
So we can just go to a vote on the issue then.
Thank you.
Thank you. This vote is to add member Grills to the Education Committee. I will begin with the vote, calling on the vote from Madam Chair. Madam Chair abstains. Vice Chair Brown? Vice Chair Brown, yes, votes yes. Member Bradford? Aye. Member Bradford votes aye. Member Grills? Aye. Member Grills votes aye. Member Holder? Aye. Member Holder votes aye. Member Jones Sawyer? Member Jones Sawyer votes aye. Member Lewis? Member Lewis votes aye. Member Montgomery Stepp? Member Montgomery Stepp votes aye. Member Tamaki? Member Tamaki votes aye. Madam Chair, there were 9 members present and voting. There were 8 ayes, 0 nays, and 1 abstention.
Okay, so it's now 4:30. Our next item on the agenda would be a break, which we can definitely take. I just want to make a note that we do have to hear from 3 different individuals representing different cities across the state of California around municipal reparations efforts. That agenda item has been slated from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. And so, let's go to my colleagues. Do you want to take a break right now? Do we just push through and honor the time that we have? I agree. So we're going to push through and we will hear from our city and county local municipal reparations efforts representatives. So I'm going to pull up the bios and we will start with the city and county of San Francisco. So the first person that we'll hear from the city and county of San Francisco is Dr. Shirl Evans Davis, who's the executive director of the San Francisco Human Rights Commission. Shirl Evans Davis is a change maker who leads relationship-driven, community-centered initiatives. Named Executive Director of the San Francisco Human Rights Commission in 2016, Davis is a passionate advocate for equity, access, and educational opportunity for all. For nearly 3 decades, she has made contributions as an educator and leader with expertise in community outreach and engagement, workforce development, youth development, and violence prevention. Dr. Davis worked to build out an equity framework with San Francisco community stakeholders and city departments, resulting in the Office of Racial Equity. She also oversees the Equity Studies Task Force, the Blue Ribbon Panel for Juvenile Justice Reform, and the Dreamkeeper Initiative, among other programs. Davis is frequently requested to speak on issues of community wellness, equity, and strategic change work. She holds a BA from San Francisco State University, an MPA from the University of San Francisco, and an educational doctorate from USC Rossier. In 2019, she was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of San Francisco. We'll also hear from Brittany Chiquata. Brittany Chiquata serves as the Director of Economic Rights at the San Francisco Human Rights Commission. In this capacity, she focuses on policy and programs to build economic equity and uplifts economic opportunities to improve quality of life for the most marginalized in San Francisco. Brittany has worked as a policy maker over the last decade, co-writing and co-leading successful campaigns with tangible impact locally and nationally. Brittany is focused on helping realize the social and health needs of the most vulnerable communities and currently does that by expanding the work of government and making radical investments toward an equitable society. We'll also hear from the city of Berkeley, Ben Barlett, who's the vice mayor of the city of Berkeley. Ben Barlett is a nationally recognized policy leader and attorney. Ben drives innovation for new approaches to government with an eye for equity, justice, and shared prosperity. Since 2016, Ben has passed more than 100 transformative policies, including blockchain municipal microbonds, modular supportive housing for the homeless, health innovation zones, health impact bonds, civilian mental health emergency responses, cannabis equity and racial equity in city contracting, EVP, infrastructure, opportunity zone, governance, and local reparations. We'll also hear from the city of San Francisco, from Kelly Fung Rivas, Senior Advisor for the Office of the Mayor, and Chiwa Rhodes, Director of Community Engagement for the Office of the Mayor. Kelly Fung Rivas serves as a Senior Advisor for the Sacramento Mayor, Daryl Steinberg. She is the first racial equity advisor to any Sacramento mayor. And then also Chiwa Rhodes joined Mayor Steinberg's office in 2021 as a Director of Community Engagement. He also serves as a president on the Sacramento City Unified School District Board of Education. He's a father of 5, a community organizer who previously organized around housing and justice policy, who grew up in South Sacramento and is a product of Sacramento Public Schools. And so, yes, we will hear from, in this order, the city and county of San Francisco, then the city of Berkeley, and then the city of Sacramento, to which then task force members will have any questions or comments, and that will be the end of item number 13. So without further ado, I will turn to the city of San Francisco. You may begin. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm Cheryl Davis, with my colleague Brittany Chiquata, who will present. I just wanted to tee up a little bit just what we've been doing in San Francisco. We had 2 parallel efforts happening that were focused on the Black community. I also am really honored and grateful for this opportunity to be before you. We have, for me, I'm like, oh, this is awesome. I grew up in Berkeley and I went to school in Sacramento. So we're all here together. Awesome. So I'll go through this pretty quickly, and then Brittany will talk about the work that we've been doing. So in 2020, Mayor Breed and then President of the Board of Supervisors, Shaman Walton, made a commitment to invest $60 million a year annually, specifically for the Black community. We do not necessarily consider this reparations, but we believe that it informs the work that we're doing towards reparations. It looks at how we have real-time allocated money based on community feedback and input, and we've had some successful outcomes of that. So I'm just going to we're in the process of doing our 2nd year review. I'm sharing the previous year review, and I'll also hit a couple of highlights. So if we go to the next slide, Want to be mindful, and I also want to just thank you all for foregoing your break and to allow us to present. So the Dreamkeeper Initiative is really focused on intergenerational efforts. It's focused on elevating the Black residents, Black community of San Francisco, and trying to focus on education, economics, and having folks feel welcome and seen and supported and being healthy and whole. Next slide, please. So the 6 foundational actions, the 6 things that we've been committed to in terms of the investing of the $60 million, which because we were delayed in the first year, it was $120 million that rolled out the first year. The foundational actions were informed by a community process. We held over 60 community meetings, heard from community members, and these 6 points: culturally affirming spaces, transformative and intergenerational social emotional wellness, financial health and well-being, Black-centered education, Black-led and Black-centered narrative shift, which is really one of the things that we're focusing a lot of attention on: the narrative, the story, the conversations of what it means to be Black in San Francisco, and building organizational knowledge and infrastructure. So those are the 6 actions that we're most focused on and where community wanted us to invest those dollars. If we go to the next slide. So what we ended up with in the first year is we started to move the money out. 141 grants were issued. Over $60 million was allocated in that first go round. And then we created an infrastructure within the city to ensure that the money and the support would roll out. And that was 29 positions. We're now up to 38 positions within the city. And the $120 million has been allocated or encumbered. And if you look at the map, it shows where those dollars are across the city, with the orange being the higher end of folks who get more money in that allocation. Next slide. And so these again are the ideas and notions. Yes, when Brittany speaks, she'll talk a little bit about the cash disbursements and requests that have been made, or that are recommendations that are coming from the Human Rights Commission's the task force that we support, the African American Reparations Advisory Committee. But what we heard from community is that they wanted accountability, but they also wanted us to do more systems change and not be focused solely on giving cash payments out to folks. And so that's a lot of what we've been piloting with the Dreamkeeper Initiative. If we go to the next slide. And we are working with evaluation firms, and we'll have a report that we'll put out in December that will look at and explain what the success or what the challenges have been. Challenges, of course, with the city has been getting the money out. Challenges have been cash disbursements and many grants, but we've had some success. When we look at the data, we were able to, in a year's time, 19 families, 19 people received over $500,000 in down payment assistance from the Dreamkeeper Initiative program. We learned how to move that money. We learned how to work and be very intentional. In years past, we only had 1 to 2 people annually, Black, that were able to go through the city's down payment assistance program. So we're learning a lot. We'll have a report from that that we'll be sure to share with the statewide committee, so that you can see kind of what we're learning from real time for trying to get money out the door, with a focus on Black people and making sure that we navigate and understand the rules around Prop 209. And I'm not sure, is there another? I think that might have been this. And then this, just the partners, this just outlines where the money lives in terms of the 60 million annualized, or 120 million from the first year, where the money sits and who are the partners in helping us get the dollars out. And so I just wanted to give that framing that, and you can stop sharing this particular slide and I think pull up for Brittany. Wanted to just give that framing that we had a parallel program that was informing the process that we're leveraging to invest in community, to hear from community and understand what the challenges are in terms of getting dollars out the door and being able to move this money with the restrictions that we have from a city government point. And so we have 141 community partners that are helping us actually get the dollars out and helping us move the funding in that way. And so while we were doing that, that launched in February of 2020. Supervisor Walton called for the Reparations Advisory Committee and introduced a resolution. And so Brittany will share more with you in that process. So this process of getting that money happening and going. In March, we had our community meetings. March through July, we had our community meetings in San Francisco, and then July through September, we started the process to move the dollars, and then the next fiscal year in June of 2021 is when we started the process for contracts to actually move the dollars. And so with that, I will yield to Brittany Chiquata.
Thank you. So if you could please pull up the other slide deck titled ARAC, A-A-R-A-C. And good afternoon, everyone. Brittany Chiquata, Director of Economic Rights at the Human Rights Commission. And just want to say clearly that our role in this work is to really capture and catalog the work of the San Francisco African American Reparations Advisory Committee. It's not to put our thumb on the scale in any direction as far as leading where the recommendations go. We really are supporting and uplifting a community-led and community-driven process. So as Director Davis alluded to, there's been a lot of overlap in the work as far as investments in Black communities in San Francisco. And it should go without saying that a lot of this timeline is rooted in the murder of George Floyd in summer of 2020, in June 2020. And so the legislation to create the African American Reparations Advisory Committee was introduced that month in June by then President of the Board, Shamon Walton. And then by December of 2020, the legislation to create the ARAC passed. They had their first meeting in January, submitted a progress report that December. And then this past December, December 23rd of 2022, submitted a draft San Francisco reparations plan to the Board of Supervisors, Mayor's Office, and the Human Rights Commission's commissioners. And so we have a hearing coming up in February where the draft plan will be reviewed by the Board of Supervisors, and they'll accept, amend, or reject the plan at that time. And then the final reparations plan is due in June of this year. And that's a typo for the sunset. It actually sunsets in January of 2024. Next. Thank you. And so we share this slide because we really are rooted in this UN definition of reparations, the 5 categories of reparations, guarantees of non-repetition, rehabilitation, monetary compensation, satisfaction, and restitution. And those have been the kind of guiding principles for the African American Reparations Advisory Committee. And I would be remiss if I didn't pause to acknowledge and say thank you to Reverend Dr. Amos Brown, who is also on San Francisco's committee. Next slide. And so these items we wanted to share just kind of where we differ from the state task force in our eligibility requirements. So we have 2 that have been identified as requisite. You have to be an individual who's identified as Black or African American on public documents for at least 10 years, and then being 18 years or older. And then in addition, you have to select 2 from the list beneath that. So born or migrated to San Francisco between 1940 and 96. And 1940, as I'm sure this audience is familiar with, that's when a lot of selective and intense recruitment happened in the South during World War II to bring Black African American people to California. San Francisco saw a multifold increase at that time. And then 1996 is that bookend is related to the one strike law that was introduced under President Clinton, really attacking residents of public housing. So if you were found with any type of drugs or drug paraphernalia, then not only would the individual be evicted, but the entire family on the lease would be. So the next one is being personally or the direct descendant of someone incarcerated by the failed war on drugs, having a record of attendance in San Francisco public schools during the time of the consent decree, which was created to complete desegregation within the school system, being a descendant of someone enslaved through U.S. chattel slavery before 1865, displaced or the direct descendant of someone displaced from San Francisco by urban renewal between 54 and 73, and then kind of similarly listed or the direct descendant of a certificate of preference holder which is San Francisco's specific, essentially promissory note that was given out to those who were displaced by urban renewal. And lastly, being a member of a historically marginalized group that experienced lending discrimination between 37 and 68, or subsequently experienced lending discrimination in formerly redlined San Francisco communities between 68 and 2008. Next slide. And so we have 111 recommendations that have been included in the draft report. The overall recommendations that are highlighted are the issuance of a formal apology for past harms and to commit to making substantial ongoing systemic and programmatic investments. And the Dreamkeeper Initiative is absolutely an example of that and a proof of concept of that work. Establishing an independent office of reparations within the city to execute these recommendations, and creating a fund, creating and funding a committee of community stakeholders to ensure equity and continuity of the implementation of initiatives. Next slide. So despite having 111 recommendations, the one salacious recommendation that has really been getting us a range of love and hate over the last 2 weeks has been the $5 million for recommendations for select eligible residents. And we know, kind of just similar to the conversation that was happening before this presentation, that despite your best efforts, what is picked up in media is not necessarily accurate. So as the staff, we are definitely fielding and driving and against this misinformation campaign that, you know, the recommendations are kind of limited to this one unrestricted cash payment for the 45,000 Black people who live in San Francisco. We're working with the committee, as I stated, to retool and update both the eligibility and the final recommendations. And everything right now is simply a proposal and nothing is written in stone. But I just wanted to acknowledge that. Next slide. And this is just kind of touching on the landscape nationwide. You can go to the next one, please. And then as far as what's to come, the Human Rights Commission will continue to convene community meetings to share information about the draft report and continue to collect feedback from community members as we retool the San Francisco reparations plan in consultation with the ARAC. We will continue to respond to community outreach about information and misinformation about the plan, and we'll be supporting the ARAC through budget season and just helping shepherd their meetings with the mayor's budget office, because the end date as far as the final document submission is also the end of the fiscal year, which is also the end of budget season. And so want to ensure that they are supported in making asks before that document is submitted to begin executing some of the recommendations as possible. Thank you.
This concludes our presentation, so we'll wait for the committee's questions.
Thank you. We'll now hear from Ben Bartlett. So we'll go through all of the municipal representatives, and then we'll reserve our comments and questions to the end. So Vice Mayor Bartlett, you may begin your testimony when you're ready.
Thank you so much. Can anyone hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, thank you so much. I must say I'm a bit distracted. I just saw the video of Tyree Nichols being murdered in Tennessee. And I just want to take a second and send prayers to his family. And again, think about why we're here and what we're doing, because this is part of it. You know, this is our country. This is our country. We built it. We made it what it is. We deserve a fair shake, and we deserve to complete reconstruction. So here in Berkeley, we intend to leverage our little municipal power, to do local reparations and contribute to the conversation somehow. And, we're a small city, but we have a tradition of punching above our weight. We are home of the Fair Housing Act. The Fair of South African Sanctions came from here. The Black Panthers are from here. Oakland claims it, but they're really from South Berkeley. And here on the slide or in the picture here is a streetscape in my district where the neighbors painted Reparations Now, because this has come from the community for years, and we are now ready to engage it. My name is Ben Bartlett, and we're going to take you through our first phase of reparations that we just passed a few months ago unanimously. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to get too far into the justifying reparations, but this quote is a good one by Dr. King. Dr. King here highlights all the government programs that went to European immigrants to come here and get land in the West and Midwest, and to till the land, and money to work it and own it, and to learn how to till it and how to do business, and then moving into housing grants and mortgages, et cetera, while at the same time telling we descendants of slavery, we Black people, to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, right? Next slide, please. And again, America is us. And this ultra prosperity that is known for America is our prosperity that has not been granted to us despite our efforts. Next slide, please. And again, this has gone into an obscene wealth distribution that has now become a deep abscess in this country that is holding the entire country back. And again, which flows from slavery to Jim Crow, both the North and the South, and the GI Bill not given to us, and housing discrimination, the loan financing, the banks, criminal bank activity against us, the education crimes against us, and the deep implicit and explicit bias and structural racism that we are continuously subjected to in all sectors of American life, as this body has covered so thoroughly and so well. Next slide, please. So we are joining the conversation. It's happening in lots of places. LA, San Francisco, St. Petersburg, Florida, Evanston, Illinois, California, North Carolina, and the United States. And again, we want to get at the root of the issue here and start to really unbuckle the restraints on the descendants of slavery here in America. That's from redlining to economic isolation, the food deserts, healthcare inequities, environmental racism, the mispolicing, as we call it, the drug war, and so on, and housing, education, and overall barriers to wealth creation that has led to us being a landless group of people being tossed about by the elements. Next slide, please. So again, we passed in Berkeley, very excited about this. Next slide. So, one element, and what we passed in Berkeley, I should say, we developed a framework to come up with a policy recommendation set, which is also according to a few different buckets. And so in our preliminary work, this is very preliminary because we will have some experts come in and run the program and do the detailed economic and historical analysis and do the legislative recommendations. But just in our own work, we uncovered some basis of economic harm. And so honing in on housing, so redlining, of course, we're no stranger to that. Berkeley was once more than 40% African American. My own family came here 150 years ago or so, fleeing Tennessee, and made it here and joined this burgeoning Black cohort of people that built big lives for themselves and really made the Black American version of this dream happen. Next slide, please. Of course, redlining gave way to gentrification, where we are now in late gentrification stages now. Next slide, please. And ultimately, this overall housing market deprivation led to an economic loss and wealth generation loss of $762,000 per person, and collectively $3.25 billion. And that's just in our little town. But our town, of course, is very, very popular and the housing market is expensive, and the escalation that many people benefited from were denied to us. Next slide. So we created this concept based upon the South African truth-telling and reconciliation process, because the community wanted to be involved in this. They wanted the act of repair to be one of transformation, and one that could catalyze the community to maybe turn the corner on history and really just deal with the abscess that has not been dealt with in this country together. So the first stage of the process that the consultants will undertake will be to inform the community. And this will be much as you've been doing, right? The historians and economists, symposiums throughout the city, gatherings, just letting people know about what happened and what it looked like. And then personal stories as well to illuminate the impact on the individual level of what happened and how it continues to play out now through this obscene wealth gap, et cetera. Next slide, please. And then there's the community process part of interaction. This is where we encourage the people to come together and have emotional conversations and really get to a through point of understanding and moving beyond conflict and into deep listening and into a new form of community so that we can begin the process of actual repair. Next slide, please. Some of the recommendations, there will come with policy recommendations, with the goal of mitigating disparities and repairing the damage caused by public and private systemic racism from here to date. Next slide, please. And so the policies, we sort of lump them into 4 buckets. There's reckoning and acknowledgement and accountability and ultimately redress. And next slide, please. So the reckoning part, this is where the city will, take the report, publish it, and present the report to the city council and to the community at large, and get everyone to understand what came out of the process, what we have, why we need reparations, what is this monster of racism, what is it, and why is it, and then next stage, what can we do about it? So next slide, please. And that gets into acknowledgement, official acknowledgement. This could take the form of apologies or new cultural sites, monuments, museums, etc. Who are these people on this slide here? I've got to talk to my staff. Next slide, please. And then accountability, where you really get into it. And in San Francisco, I saw some of the similar language on their deck. This is where you commit to not repeating the actions, and then allow the community to form accountability sort of advisory bodies to engage and maintain the process of reparations through the years as we go forward. So they keep it going, keep monitoring it, and keep developing it. Okay, next slide, please. And then, of course, redress. And this is where we get into the end goal of this, right? So these would be acts of compensation and restitution to the harmed, with the objectives centering on wealth creation, because at the core of this is the lack of wealth, despite the generation of wealth for others. And that is the source of our weakness and the source of all of the negative outcomes come from our lack of wealth. Next slide, please. So again, outcomes involve promoting generational wealth, economic mobility, opportunity, and getting to the disparities I mentioned before in health attainment, homeownership, criminal justice, education, etc. Next slide, please. And these are some examples we come up with, and we'll like to see them all developed and rolled out. Cash payments could be lump sum or an income supplement, retirement, city support, corporate debtors too, which we'll talk about in a moment. Housing, homeownership, got to get homeownership. Ownership is key. And there is a trend right now to make homeownership more out of reach for people. Nationally, there are large private equity funds buying up all the single family residences to make the entire country a nation of renters. That does not help us achieve any power in our lives. We've got to hone in on ownership no matter what. Rental guarantees, stabilization, paying supplements, waiving fees. Big one, converting all the public housing into condominiums. That idea came up. That is a low-hanging fruit to rapidly turn someone who's a renter into an owner, and with something they can pass on to their family and generate equity in. Mortgage financing. Then you get into debt forgiveness, student loans, health loans. Healthcare costs are the largest source of bankruptcy in America. And of course, we're hit the hardest by that, like we are with everything else. So honing in on the money apparatus and making it less burdensome to the people who create the wealth in this country. Tax credits, education, job training, small business grants, contracts with Black businesses, things like that. Next slide. And here's a big one. Being as how we are a small city, our budget is very small. So we're going to be creative about how we can meet the needs of redress. And so one way we intend to explore is bringing in the corporate actors who benefit from racial tyranny. And these are financial institutions, the banks, insurance companies, real estate companies, universities, you name it. The whole course of human economic activity that was born of our labor implicates many companies who are based in Berkeley right now and throughout California as well. And they should be part of this process. Next slide. And of course, we want to sync up with other cities because, again, we went from 40-something% African American down to 8%. Our people are now spread out in other communities, lacking the wealth they would have made if they'd stayed in Berkeley, a high resource community. So to sync up with them and see if we can possibly create an interjurisdictional framework of repair. Next slide, please. So moving forward, like I said, we work with the jurisdictions in California, and I'm so thankful for this body here. I've been watching you the whole time. It's really amazing the rigor you put into developing this process. And I must say I'm very proud of you, and I know that your ancestors are thankful for your work, as mine are for sure, and your children, my children, and so forth are thankful for the work you're doing right now. California is the biggest state in the country, fifth largest economy in the world, and what you're doing matters, and I thank you so much. And again, the RFP is coming out for this consultant to do our reparations, to implement the framework we've written, and I want you to apply. So if anyone's watching who's got some skills, please apply, because you're welcome to help us achieve this. Next slide, and it should be the end. That's me. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, that's great. Thank you so much, Vice Mayor Bartlett. It's a long time coming. I remember connecting with you when we first started this almost 2 years ago. So thank you so much for your presentation. The next city we'll hear from is the city of Sacramento. Kelly Fong Rivas, and you may begin your presentation when you're ready, and Mr. Rose.
Thank you very much. Thank you for pulling up the slides. I'll wait for them to get set. My name is Kelly Fong Rivas. I am a senior advisor to Mayor Darrell Steinberg. I'm joined by my colleague, Chinua Rhodes, who is our Director of Community Engagement. Go ahead, next slide. And just want to say good afternoon and thank you, Chair Moore, for the invitation to present today alongside some really wonderful jurisdictions. Great to be in the space with City and County of San Francisco and City of Berkeley. Also, thank you to all the members of our task force for your service. We are extremely grateful for your time, your expertise, and your dedication to this important work. We are here today to really talk about our focus on building a thoughtful municipal reparations effort in support of a national reparations movement. And that's why we wanted to really start and center on building and the concept of building relationships with one another, with our community across jurisdictions, building the research that's necessary to really ensure that we have sustainable programs and recommendations, building the resources necessary for this as well, building the transparency that's needed in terms of how we make decisions within government and within bodies like this in order to build the accountability necessary for us to account for our past harms committed as governments. Only through those steps do we believe that we can really build the trust with community, especially those who have been at the center of harm, in order to bring about and build the culture change that we're all working towards, so that this is not just a moment, but really is making sure that we are building this movement, like we said, at a local level to help support reparations at a national level. Next slide. So a little bit of background just to center some basics about the city of Sacramento and how we've approached this work. We are a city manager form of government. Another way of saying that is we are not a strong mayor form of government. So while we are working on this, it's important to note that it is a mayoral initiative. Our city council did in June of 2021 adopt a resolution that supports the very work of this task force, which we are grateful for. And at that same time, Mayor Steinberg joined the MORE Coalition, Mayors Organized for Reparations and Equity. So as such, our municipal reparations work at this time is not a full city priority or adopted by full city council. It is a mayoral initiative. Next slide. Within that, we really truly believe that no matter how we come to this work or what level of government that we work within, that we really need to understand and evaluate our role and responsibility as public servants while we have the honor of serving in these roles. So evaluating our role and responsibility, we believe that, at its most basic form, that government is responsible for the allocation of resources and services necessary for human settlement. And that really, when you think about good governance, it's actively ensuring that equitable access to those resources and services. So some of the questions and things that we are ensuring we center and reflect on are really reviewing and asking ourselves some sets of questions about what has the city done to exclude our Black residents from access to resources and opportunities through urban planning and design, through other policy decisions, through these types of things that have extracted wealth or prevented wealth building opportunities. We also really want to understand time. What are these specific periods of harm that have, caused these types of practices? What have exclusionary practices and decisions been that have impacted our Black businesses, residents, and community over time? And really understanding that in terms of health. The social determinants of health reveal the symptoms of these impacts that must be addressed. But how do we address the root cause to prevent the continued and or future impacts of these? Really getting at those systemic root causes, and also really understanding and asking ourselves, what does success look like? For example, what will it take for Sacramento to improve homeownership for our Black residents and for them to truly feel safe at home and in their neighborhoods? And it's important to note that success cannot be defined by us within the role of government. It really needs to center our community in defining that. Next slide. So just a little bit of background on the staff work before we get into a little bit more of what we talked about as we are really centering community in this work. It's important to know beyond success being defined in our community, that they are with us through every step of that process. There are some things, however, that are really important for us to do to be prepared to do this work, not only to set the foundation to support community in this effort, but so that we ourselves are prepared and ensure that we can support our community in the work. So what that's looked like so far is network building, really developing a community of practice of national experts, advocates, activists, and other cities who are doing this work, and just ensuring that we can have real partners in this to support the process and the outcomes, learning from each other, both from mistakes and from best practices. This includes doing a lot of research compilation, utilizing our staff time, utilizing existing city commission reports and information, ensuring that we are also going after grants so that we can support our graduate students doing some of the deep dive research in our city archives to understand those specific points of harm and what happened with those policy decisions. Building that academic partnership so that we can develop a true historic context and really understand those areas of opportunity for our community to be able to determine what some recommendations could look like. And finally, really collecting and ensuring that we can get some resources together to support this. So that looks like securing city funding to support the work, again, going after grant funding to support research and programs, and identifying other potential resources to support future recommendations that really can support a community-led process. So with that, I would like to invite Chinua Rhodes for the next slide and conversation.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Chinua Rhodes, Director of Community Engagement for Mayor Dale Steimer's office, and it's a pleasure to be here with you guys today. As you see, the theme for our community engagement is building together. And I know that most of you guys probably heard this saying of when communities have things done to them, it's often seen as violence. When they have things done with them, it's seen as liberation. And so we wanted to engage community through a process of informing them, engaging them, and empowering them. And through those phases, what we were able to do was first start off with one-to-one conversation and group conversations with our constituents and community members. And that first step was an effort to change the traditional and often expected mechanism that our communities used to, the transactional form of government, and hopefully bring in a more transformative and relationship building to the conversation. After that, we had wonderful conversations, and we brought together a subset of community members, from activists to our municipalities, our local energy municipalities, bankers, restaurateurs, Black business associations, to have further conversations of who's missing in the space. And how do we properly engage with our African-American community largely to make sure that they're being involved and their voice is heard. One of the things that I think that is very important to say is that as elected officials, or as our mayor, he's really put forward the idea of empowering community voice to be at the center and to be the leading voice in what we do here in Sacramento, California. Even though we are in our infancy of reparation implementation, we are pragmatically positioning our city to make sure that we are doing with our communities and not to our communities. And so as we continue to do this work and we continue to gain more information, next week we can have a larger group conversation, half-day retreat around what we're going to be doing here in the city of Sacramento. And it's very exciting. Once again, African-American male grew up here in the city, and most people would never imagine that these type of conversations here in the capital city would be happening, or even at the state level. And so as we go into the future with this idea of bringing along community, genuinely bringing along our communities and having a real voice, these are the things that we're talking about here in Sacramento, California, and these are the ways that we're engaging our community, not transactionally, but hopefully transformatively. Thank you.
Thank you. Next slide. So some of the goals and progress around this, as you heard, are really about community-centered. It's important to emphasize that no formal program or commission or committee or task force will be developed by us, decisions made about municipal reparations without a community-led and engaged process. Our community's already advocated for a very reparative process and approach, so I just want to emphasize that as well as one of our goals, that the process itself is reparative. It means that it's really important to ensure that any of our outreach and activity within our community utilizes a trauma-informed approach and provides culturally relevant resources for our community to process these conversations and these deep wounds that we're opening up with the intent to repair and heal, and recognizing too that as we are having these conversations, there are many things that continue to happen in our country, like today. Some of the progress that we've made right now includes research specific around examples of promising practices across the country, really getting a deeper dive into our local historical context and points of harm. That includes areas of redevelopment that displace Black residents and businesses, ensuring that we are doing oral history collection so that we can close the gaps between the data and available resources with the stories of our elders who lived through this and before those stories go away, really ensuring that we are connected to our experts and networks throughout as well. And again, researching various opportunities for funding and collaboration so that we don't go this alone. This is all in service to really create an introductory report that can support our community in the beginning of deliberations of what type of form they would like to create in terms of a commission or committee. Some of the resources we have so far to support this that were secured in our 2022 mid-year adjustment of our budget is $200,000 to support the work of a municipal commission in terms of how that would develop. Another $150,000 to support culturally sensitive and trauma-informed facilitation and support services. We have secured around another $130,000 in grants through various programs that I'll speak to next a little bit in the next slide. Some of the concurrent related projects mentioned that support this work but are not directly a part of the mayoral initiative include our city's African American Experience Project. This is a grant-funded project that our Community Development Department was able to get, and it is an effort of our city to compile a very detailed historical context and report that really is informed by collecting oral history and historical documents from our community in the production of a thematic historic context that can really help us better understand as we do things around historical designation, buildings and places that were moved that may not qualify under current policies. What do those mean in terms of historic context to the community, and how do we redefine that? It also is moving beyond that historic context statement to really continue to collect oral histories. And that's another key part that we have learned as a best practice and lesson in terms of closing those gaps and filling in the details of what have happened. Another grant-funded project that we'll be kicking off in the next couple months is called City Start. And this is a new program for the city of Sacramento. We applied for in a very competitive process, and we're able, through the community's financial empowerment, to be included in this year's cohort. It is an opportunity to create and release a very strategic blueprint that addresses residents' financial empowerment needs. And the unique thing about this year's cohort is that it really prioritizes the financial stability needs of our Black residents. And this is based on stakeholder and community engagement, and it's really focused on addressing those structural causes rather than the symptoms. Another key initiative that's happening is through our Center for Sacramento History. They're partnering with our city's preservation division and other community experts to hold a series of workshops on how to trace genealogy. They're also working through some additional productions of history, of racism, and that's been really important for us to help educate our community at large. On the next slide, I'll get into a little bit more about the last project that's related to this work that's really centered around building up that trust and transparency and accountability, again, with our community. This is focused on racial equity, and I just want to make a really quick important distinction that we do not see racial equity the same as reparations. They can inform one another, but they are not the same. So this initiative we call the SCORE initiative. It's Sacramento centered on racial equity. And it really is a work plan and a new partnership, as you heard Chinua talk about, in terms of engaging and empowering our community, not being transactional. But this is an effort and partnership between the city of Sacramento, between Race Forward as a facilitator, their national organization dedicated to catalyzing movement building for racial justice, and our local community racial equity leaders. So this is a partnership and coalition together. It's a multi-year, multi-phased work plan, and it's really designed to transform how our city, both internally and externally, really reviews our policies and procedures to achieve racial equity through developing a racial equity lens. Next slide. Some of the key lessons we just wanted to lift up for others that may be looking to do a reparations effort in their own jurisdictions are really understanding that local government plays a significant role in harm and repair, regardless of reparations at a national level. We are where people live. We are where neighborhoods are built and designed. So really understanding that and our role within it is key and essential of how we can help repair. Centering and empowering our community in the process and the outcome, as you've heard us talk about, understanding that the process itself must be reparative. One thing we talk about a lot here in Sacramento is moving at the speed of trust with our community and really recognizing that at times that means slowing down. You know, why don't we have a commission yet or a committee? That has been a process of slowing down to ensure that we can do so in a reparative way with community. But it also means speeding up when you need to and acting with urgency to meet the real needs that are happening. And finally, just very consistent and open communication and education is essential. Next slide. We just wanted to sort of in summary, really again, build into that this is a movement for reparations that's happening like never before in our country. We see it here with this commission and the groundbreaking work that you were doing. We see it with local efforts across the country. We are very fortunate to have a community in a city that is really engaged in a very intentional and thoughtful racial equity process of addressing the past, developing trust and accountability in the present, and building a racially just future together. We believe that we go farther together and are taking the time to do so with our community so that our work to develop a municipal reparations program is not some stagnant study that sits somewhere or just a moment in time or a performative action, but really a sustained effort that will disrupt the extraction of wealth and wealth building opportunities from our Black community. We really do hope that this process and effort that we are taking can help move some national efforts. And then finally, in the next slide, we just wanted to close by really thanking our community for their expertise, their engagement, their support in this. We have some incredible leaders that have been very engaged with this task force and the work. We want to thank Mayor Darrell Steinberg for committing to this effort and for allowing us the space to help lead with community. We want to thank every member of this task force for your public service to the state. And we just have to say, finally, I think we'd be remiss if we did not lift up and close our presentation today in memory of Mr. Tyree Nichols. And I want to say thank you, Vice Mayor Bartlett, for lifting up his name a moment ago. He is a former Sacramento resident. Members of his family were here at City Hall with us just hours ago with our local NAACP branch and mayor for a press conference. And as his name is on our country's conscience today, and as we speak about the importance of centering community in a reparative process for reparations, I just would like to say to our community, please take care of yourselves and one another today. We are here for you. Tyree Nichols, may you rest in peace. Thank you for your time.
Any questions or comments from the task force members around any of the presenters? Member Grills, you're recognized.
I'd just say thank you to all of the municipalities that shared the status of your work with us today. It's very important and importantly connects with the work that we're doing. And so I actually don't have a question, but a request of all of you. If you might take an opportunity to take a look at the recommendations that we have drafted, which are available by looking through the agenda items for this meeting, and letting us know whether or not there are any of our recommendations that could be strengthened or nuanced or further informed by the work that you're doing in your local municipalities. That would be very helpful to us. Because I fully agree with Ms. Kelly Fong-Rivas, when you said that local government plays a significant role in harm and repair. You're boots on the ground and you have a way of understanding things that we may not be able to see with a statewide lens. Thank you.
I had a question for the city of San Francisco. You know, you all have been in the news as of late. But a question that I had was around the eligibility piece and to what extent you all, reached out to legal experts to help inform you all on your eligibility criteria. I'm just curious about that.
Thank you, Chair, for that question. So the recommendations were developed mostly at the leadership of the African American Reparations Advisory Committee. I think in this period of retooling and refining the draft plan, we're doing some additional work in that manner of checking both with economics consultants as well as legal experts. But we did have some initial meetings in the fall and winter with legal experts, particularly those with extensive experience in Prop 209 and civil rights advocacy. I think that one thing that the committee uplifted throughout the process was wanting to procure outside counsel and not necessarily work with the city attorney's office for the city and county of San Francisco, just because the city attorney works at the leisure and with the liability of the city in mind, and is not, staff attorney for the committee. And so we're definitely seeking outside counsel or working in partnership with them to facilitate outside guidance as we refine the final document.
And I will just add, we've been very intentional. We've got a report that's coming. We've been working with Stanford Law School as well. And so they've had 2 semesters of classes and students who've reviewed the documents that we put forth and the recommendations. They'll put out a report later this spring, just based on some of that. And just in terms of context, we really did ask the committee members to dream big, think big, and then part of one of the pieces that we have is a policy committee that their recommendations are specifically around how we continue to have conversations around Prop 209 and the limitations to discuss and talk about race. So it's one of the recommendations is specifically around how do we address some of these and get legal counsel to help, not just with enforcing reparations, but being able to address the harms and changing the systems that make it difficult to do so.
Thank you so much. Any other comments or questions? Hearing no other comments or questions, I would like to thank the City of San Francisco, the City of Berkeley, and the City of Sacramento. Everyone, give them a round of applause. Stay encouraged. You all are doing amazing work, and I'm so glad that we are in conversation and in concert with each other. Thank you so much. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is item number 14, which is a conversation about extending the life of the task force. Senator Bradford, do you want to table this? Okay, so we will table this conversation until tomorrow, unless we need a formal vote motion for that. If not, let's just table it. And then the next item on the agenda is DOJ updates, to which I've heard there are none.
Wait, I just want to clarify. Are you tabling this discussion? Are you saying you're tabling this discussion till tomorrow or till the next meeting?
Tomorrow, under unfinished business.
We have a hard stop tomorrow at 5:45, 5 o'clock, 5 o'clock in this room. So it's a hard stop tomorrow. So we cannot run long tomorrow. So if there's any concern about tomorrow's agenda, I'd encourage you to keep that in mind.
It shouldn't take more than 20 minutes.
But that's fine. I mean, and we do not have any updates, so.
Okay. I'm looking at tomorrow's agenda. I mean, it is a pretty busy agenda, but we could, make sure we're keeping tight on time. So I think seems like you want to table it. So let's table it and we'll just figure it out tomorrow. All right, so this meeting is now officially in recess. We'll return tomorrow at 9 a.m.
All right, fam. We're gonna have a recap tonight. So if you don't see the recap tonight on the replay or the bell, hit that bell. We are going to be going live tonight to do a day 1 recap. A lot of information to unpack. We're gonna have some special guests in the building, so that should be fun. Education, always. We do like to entertain too, but education first. Facts over fiction. All right, fam. See y'all tomorrow. My mic went on mute. Can you hear me now? I guess not. Anyway, Kim's saying my mic's on mute. I don't know. Can y'all hear me? Okay, I don't know if you can hear me. Okay, yeah, it's going to be tonight, Michael. Tonight we're going to have the recap, so just stay in tune. I don't know exactly what. Okay, cool. See, he does hear me. Peace out to Michael. Appreciate that, bro. So yeah, we're going to have a recap tonight. Don't know exactly what time it will be, but we're definitely going to have it. But just hit that bell. We'll definitely let you know when it goes up. And if you don't see it tonight, then on YouTube, bro. It's not on YouTube. So yeah, just come back, and we're gonna have a recap and put in the comments. Let us know what you like or dislike about today, especially the California residency. So on that note, do you have an outro or something?
The way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
You know, Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million. And then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.